331. That was the wound count on Jayna Murray's body, an overkill so savage it defied logic. Inside the blood-slicked Bethesda Lululemon, the air heavy with the scent of iron, a miracle was discovered. Brittany Norwood lay bound nearby, weeping, the sole survivor of a midnight massacre by two masked phantoms. It was a harrowing tale of survival, until the evidence revealed that the monsters hadn't broken in. They were already on the clock. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Bethesda, Maryland is more than just a suburb. It is an enclave of relentless ambition. Located just northwest of the nation's capital, it serves as a manicured sanctuary for Washington's elite, lawyers, lobbyists, and high-level consultants who demand perfection in every facet of their lives. At the heart of this meticulously groomed community lies Bethesda Row, a sprawling outdoor shopping district where the brick-paved streets are lined with high-end boutiques and gourmet eateries. It is a place where the air itself feels expensive, and the concept of violent crime feels like a distant, gritty fiction from another world. In 2011, there was perhaps no brand that encapsulated the Bethesda lifestyle more perfectly than Lululemon Athletica. Lululemon was far more than a retail store. It was a secular temple for the health-conscious. The brand sold a specific brand of enlightenment wrapped in high-performance fabric. Every store featured the manifesto on its shopping bags, a collection of affirmations about living in the moment, breathing deeply, and pursuing greatness. The employees weren't just sales clerks, they were educators, tasked with building community and inspiring customers to reach their peak physical and mental potential. To work at the Bethesda Row location was to be at the epicenter of this cult of wellness. It was a fast-paced environment that demanded both physical stamina and a sunny, unflappable disposition that mirrored the brand's aspirational image. Among the rising stars at the Bethesda store was 30-year-old Jayna Murray. To those who knew her, Jayna was the human embodiment of the Lululemon manifesto. She was a woman who didn't just walk through life. She lunged through it with purpose and an infectious, wide-toothed grin. Born in Kansas and raised in Texas, Jayna possessed a blend of Midwestern warmth and a sophisticated global curiosity. She was a polymath of energy, an athlete who competed in Ironman triathlons, a traveler who had explored the cobblestone streets of Europe and the rugged landscapes of South America, and a scholar with a ferocious appetite for knowledge. At the time, Jayna was balancing her responsibilities at Lululemon with a grueling academic schedule. She was enrolled in a dual-degree program at Johns Hopkins University, pursuing both a Master of Business Administration and a Master of Arts in Communication. She wasn't just looking for a career, she was building an empire of her own making. Her colleagues and friends described her as the glue, the person who organized the group dinners, the one who remembered birthdays, and the woman who could turn a standard retail shift into a masterclass in team building. She was bright, blonde, and possessed a level of competence that was both inspiring and, to some, perhaps a bit intimidating. Her life was a mosaic of high-achieving fragments. She was a devoted daughter, a supportive sister, and a friend who seemed to have cracked the code of the 24-hour day. In the rare moments she wasn't studying or working, she was outside, her athletic frame moving through the world with a grace that suggested she was perfectly in sync with her surroundings. She was the quintessential Bethesda success story in the making, a woman on the verge of a brilliant future. But as Jayna Murray was scaling the heights of her personal and professional life, another woman was entering the same orbit from a much more fractured trajectory. Brittany Norwood, 28, also shared the athletic pedigree that Lululemon coveted. She was a former college soccer standout at Stony Brook University, known for her speed on the field and her ability to navigate complex social circles. To her family and many of her peers, Brittany was a success story in her own right. One of 7 children from a hardworking family, she had used her athletic prowess to secure an education and a foothold in the competitive world of high-end fitness retail. On the surface, Brittany and Jayna were two sides of the same coin. Both were young, fit, and ambitious women working in a prestigious environment. But beneath Brittany's carefully maintained educator persona lay a history of professional instability and troubling behavior that had followed her from job to job. There were whispers of petty thefts at previous workplaces, of small sums of money disappearing from lockers, and of a strange chameleon-like ability to tell different stories to different people. While Jayna Murray's life was built on a foundation of transparency and relentless effort, Brittany's was increasingly becoming a house of cards, held together by small lies and a desperate need to maintain the appearance of the golden girl athlete she had once been. By early 2011, these two women, one soaring, the other quietly unraveling, were placed on a collision course within the narrow, mirror-lined aisles of the Bethesda Row store. The corporate culture that preached honesty and integrity was about to become the backdrop for a confrontation that would strip away the veneer of the Bethesda elite and reveal a darkness that no amount of positive thinking or yoga could ever hope to dispel. The professional convergence of Jayna Murray and Brittany Norwood within the glass-fronted confines of the Bethesda Row Lululemon was, at first glance, a seamless match of brand and personnel. In the high-stakes environment of premium retail, where the educator role demanded a blend of athletic credibility and approachable charm, both women appeared to be ideal representatives. They were both physically fit, seemingly disciplined, and possessed the outward confidence of women who had spent their lives competing at high levels. For several months in late 2010 and early 2011, they moved through the store's minimalist aisles, folding stacks of Luon fabric, assisting the yoga-obsessed elite of Maryland, and projecting an image of synchronized wellness. Yet the foundations upon which their lives were built could not have been more disparate. To understand the friction that would eventually ignite into a fatal explosion, one must look at the athletic legacy Brittany Norwood brought to Bethesda. Years before she arrived in Maryland, Brittany was a force to be reckoned with on the soccer fields of Stony Brook University in New York. As a standout defender, she was described by coaches as a linchpin of the team's backline, a player whose speed and aggressive tactics earned her all-conference and all-region accolades. To the public and the local sports media, she was a success story, a woman whose grit on the field suggested a future of leadership and distinction. However, behind the scenes at Stony Brook, a far more troubling narrative was taking shape. While Brittany was a star in the jersey, her teammates and roommates whispered about a persistent, shadow-like habit that followed her into the locker rooms and shared dormitories. Multiple peers from her university days later recounted a pattern of behavior that pointed toward kleptomania, small, inexplicable thefts of cash, clothing, and personal items. One teammate was so disturbed by the constant disappearances of her belongings that she eventually quit the team altogether, unable to reconcile the golden girl image Brittany projected with the reality of her light-fingered habits. There were even deeper cracks in the facade. Allegations of stalking an ex-boyfriend surfaced from 2007, leading to a restraining order. Despite these warning signs, Brittany had no formal criminal record when she applied to Lululemon, allowing her to successfully navigate the hiring process and slip into the educator role with her secrets intact. Jayna Murray, by contrast, lived a life of radical transparency. As she balanced her store shifts with her dual master's degrees at Johns Hopkins, her ambition was fueled by a genuine desire for achievement rather than the maintenance of an illusion. While Brittany's energy often felt performative, a mask designed to hide a growing list of professional failures and social debts, Jayna's was grounded in a relentless, triathlete-level work ethic. As the two worked side by side, the subtle differences in their temperaments began to grate. Jayna was the person who followed every rule to the letter, while Brittany was increasingly viewed by some staff members as someone who cut corners, a woman whose sweet and funny exterior was starting to wear thin under the pressure of Bethesda's high expectations. The tension reached a critical mass on the afternoon of Friday, March 11th, 2011. It was a standard closing shift, the kind of mundane routine that usually ended with a quick exchange of pleasantries and the locking of the front doors. However, Lululemon maintained a strict security protocol known as the bag check. Before leaving the premises, employees were required to inspect one another's bags to ensure that no unpaid merchandise was being taken home. It was a routine intended to foster a culture of honesty, but on this particular evening, it became a trap. As Jayna Murray performed the check on Britney's bag, she discovered something that shattered the professional courtesy between them: a pair of Lululemon yoga pants that had not been purchased. To Jayna, this wasn't just a minor infraction. It was a betrayal of the community-based values the brand preached. She didn't confront Britney with a scene. Instead, she followed the chain of command. After they left the store and parted ways, Jayna contacted their manager, Rachel Ertley, to report what she had found. The manager, perhaps exhausted by the long week, told Jayna that the matter would be handled in the morning. For Britney Norwood, that phone call represented the end of her carefully curated world. In the status-conscious ecosystem of Bethesda, being branded a thief was more than just a reason for termination. It was a social death sentence. Her identity as a Golden Girl athlete, her standing in her large family, and her future career prospects were all tied to the image of the high-achieving professional she pretended to be. If Jayna Murray was allowed to speak the truth in the morning, the house of cards would collapse. Driven by a cold, desperate pragmatism, Britney reached for her phone only minutes after the manager had been alerted. She called Jayna Murray, her voice likely trembling with a fabricated urgency. She told Jayna that she had forgotten her wallet, or perhaps her keys, inside the darkened store and begged for her help to get back inside. Jayna, ever the helper, ever the woman who made people feel needed, agreed to return. She drove her car back to Bethesda Row, unsuspecting of the shift in the atmosphere. When she pulled up to the curb and saw Britney waiting in the shadows near the entrance, she believed she was performing a final act of kindness for a coworker in distress. As the alarm was deactivated at 10:05 p.m. and the heavy glass door swung shut behind them, the two women entered a space that was no longer a boutique, but a closed-loop arena. Jayna Murray walked into the back of the store, moving toward the employee area to help her friend find a missing item. Entirely unaware that the woman behind her had spent the last 20 minutes transitioning from a desperate employee into something far more predatory. The silence of the high-end mall began to settle around them, a silence that would soon be shattered by the first of 331 strikes. The heavy glass door of the Lululemon boutique clicked shut at 10:05 p.m., sealing the two women inside a silent, high-end tomb. The store was bathed in the dim, artificial glow of security lights, casting long, geometric shadows across the racks of yoga gear. Jayna moved toward the back of the store, her mind likely occupied by the administrative headache of the morning's impending report. She had no reason to look over her shoulder. She had no reason to suspect that the woman she had just befriended, the woman she was helping out of a jam, was currently scanning the room for a heavy object. The attack did not begin with a shout, it began with a choice. Britney reached for the nearest heavy-duty tool, a hammer used for store maintenance, and struck the first blow. It was a strike delivered with the explosive power of a collegiate athlete, catching Jayna completely off guard. The shift in reality was instantaneous. The sanctuary of the wellness brand was replaced by a visceral, primitive struggle for survival. As the struggle moved from the front of the store into the back hallway and the narrow employee bathroom, the violence escalated into something beyond a mere murder. It became a frantic, multi-weapon assault. Britney did not bring a gun or a knife to the scene. Instead, she treated the retail space like a grotesque arsenal. Investigators would later determine that at least 5 different weapons were used: a hammer, a heavy wrench, a box cutter, and even a peg from a display rack. The auditory experience of that night was hauntingly recorded by the only witnesses who didn't know they were listening to a crime. Next door, at the Apple store, 2 employees were still on the clock, performing inventory in the quiet of the late night. Through the shared wall, they heard the sounds of a nightmare. They later told investigators they heard thuds, the sound of bodies hitting the floor, and a woman's voice screaming in terror. One of the employees recalled hearing a voice, likely Jana's, pleading for her life, asking her attacker to talk to her, begging for a reason why this was happening. There was a chilling silence, followed by more thuds. For reasons that remain a point of bitter debate in the community, the Apple Store employees didn't call the police. They assumed it was just a loud argument, perhaps a domestic dispute that was none of their business. They went back to their work, while less than 12 inches of drywall away, Jana Murray was being methodically dismantled. The sheer volume of the overkill is what eventually broke the case wide open. Jana did not die quickly. The medical examiner's report was a map of unimaginable agony. Out of the 331 distinct wounds, the majority were concentrated on her head and upper body. There were deep lacerations from the box cutter, blunt force trauma from the hammer that fractured her skull, and defensive wounds on her hands and forearms that showed she had fought back with everything she had. Her fingers were sliced to the bone as she tried to grab the blades. Despite the onslaught, Jana managed to stay alive for a significant portion of the attack. Forensic evidence suggested she was still breathing when her spinal cord was finally severed, a terminal strike intended to ensure she would never speak again. As the life drained from Jana on the floor of the back hallway, Brittany Norwood did not flee. She did not panic. Instead, she entered a state of cold, clinical calculation that lasted for nearly 8 hours. The transition from a killer to a victim was a masterpiece of staging. Brittany knew that her presence at the store would be impossible to explain unless she was also a target of the masked men she intended to invent. She began by addressing her own appearance. Using the same box cutter that had ended Jana's life, Brittany carefully sliced through her own Lululemon attire. She inflicted shallow, superficial scratches on her own arms and chest, wounds that were painful enough to look convincing, but nowhere near the lethal depth of the injuries she had inflicted on Jana. She even went as far as to create a small mark on her forehead. The most sophisticated part of the deception involved the floor. Brittany found a pair of men's size 14 sneakers in the back of the store, merchandise used for display or as samples. She put them on and began walking through Jana's blood. She paced through the store, creating a trail of large, masculine footprints that seemed to suggest 2 intruders had been stalking the premises. She made sure the prints led toward the back and around the body, but she made a critical error that would eventually haunt her. The intruder only seemed to walk in certain directions, and the prints never quite made it to the exits in a logical way. After the men were created, Brittany proceeded to bind herself. She used zip ties and scraps of fabric to tie her own wrists and ankles, positioning herself in the back of the store near Jana's cooling remains. She tucked herself into a corner, surrounded by the carnage she had authored, and waited. The psychological endurance required to sit in that darkness is almost impossible to fathom. For hours, Brittany sat in the silence of the boutique, feet away from her mangled coworker, rehearsing the story she would tell. She waited for the morning sun to hit the brick of Bethesda Row. She waited for the sounds of the morning commute, for the click of the manager's key in the front door. She sat there, a predator in a victim's skin, preparing to deliver the performance of her life to the first person who walked through the door. By the time the store manager arrived at 8 a.m., Brittany was ready. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a woman who had endured the unthinkable, or so she hoped the world would believe. The sun rose over Bethesda Row on Saturday, March 12, 2011, with a clinical brightness that usually signaled a lucrative weekend for the local merchant class. For Rachel Ertley, the store manager, the morning began with the rhythmic, caffeinated checklist of a retail lead, coffee in hand, the crisp spring air, and the anticipation of a busy Saturday morning shift. But as she approached the glass-fronted sanctuary of the Lululemon boutique at approximately 8 a.m., the familiar rhythm fractured. The heavy glass doors, which should have been bolted shut until the official opening, were slightly ajar. There was no sign of a forced entry, no shattered glass on the pavement, just an unnerving, heavy silence that seemed to push back against the morning light. Inside, the minimalist, high-energy aesthetic of the store had been transformed into a landscape of chaotic disarray. Piles of high-end athletic wear were strewn across the floor, but it wasn't the harmless mess of a busy sale. It was the wreckage of a desperate struggle. Ortley hesitated at the threshold, the stillness of the mannequins feeling like a silent warning. As she moved deeper into the store, the scent hit her first. The thick, iron-rich tang of stagnant blood that hung heavy in the air, clashing with the faint, lingering scent of expensive candles. In the back of the store, near the employee hallway, the manager stumbled upon the center of the nightmare. Jayna Murray lay in a pool of dark crimson, her body so catastrophically damaged that she was nearly unrecognizable as the vibrant woman who had closed the store the night before. And then, a sound. A faint, rhythmic thumping from the darkness of the employee bathroom. In the cramped confines of the restroom, Ortley discovered Brittany Norwood. She was huddled on the floor, her wrists and ankles bound with zip ties, her clothing torn and bloodied, her face a mask of dried tears and shock. To Ortley and to the first responders who flooded the scene minutes later, the narrative was self-evident. This was a robbery gone horribly wrong, a brutal, senseless act of violence against two defenseless women. As paramedics lifted Brittany onto a stretcher, her voice was a fragile whisper. She told them they were still in the store. She asked if the men were gone. This initial, panicked question cemented her status as a victim in the eyes of everyone wearing a uniform. The survivor's tale that Brittany delivered over the next several hours was a masterpiece of fabricated trauma. In her hospital bed, surrounded by the beeping monitors and the hushed tones of detectives, she described a night of sustained terror. She told investigators that after she and Jayna had re-entered the store to retrieve her forgotten wallet, two men in dark clothing and masks had slipped in behind them. She provided a vivid description of the phantoms. One man was tall, perhaps 6 feet, while the other was shorter. Both possessed a cold, predatory energy. She claimed the men had beaten them with whatever tools they could find, subjected her to a sexual assault, and forced Jayna into the back hallway where the most brutal sounds originated. Brittany's performance was meticulously calibrated. She spoke of the hours she spent bound in the darkness, listening to Jayna's muffled pleas. She recounted how she had prayed for the morning to come, certain that she would be the next one to die. She even added a layer of psychological depth, telling the detectives that the men had told her they were doing this because they liked to hear them scream. It was a story designed to evoke maximum empathy while simultaneously pointing the police toward a non-existent external threat. The social echo of this discovery was instantaneous and paralyzing. Bethesda, a community that prided itself on its bubble of safety, was suddenly gripped by a visceral collective panic. Rumors of the masked killers spread through the affluent neighborhoods like a contagion. Yoga studios canceled their Saturday morning classes. Parents refused to let their teenagers walk to the nearby cinema, and the local police department shifted into a high-intensity, all-hands-on-deck manhunt. The local news cycles were dominated by Brittany's heroism, the woman who had survived the unthinkable and was now the only living link to the predators. The community looked at her as a symbol of resilience, a golden girl who had looked into the face of evil and lived. For the lead investigators, including Detective Dimitri Rubin, Brittany was initially treated as a sacred witness. They were gentle with their questioning, mindful of her post-traumatic state. She gave them a timeline that seemed to fit. She spoke of a dark van the men might have used, and she even described the way the taller man moved with a slight limp. It was a performance that nearly held up under the initial scrutiny of a grieving town. But as the forensic teams began the grueling process of reading the store, the physics of the crime scene began to scream louder than Brittany's whispers. The survivor was talking, but the blood spatter was starting to tell a different story. The detectives noticed that while Jayna had been subjected to 331 strikes, Brittany's injuries were curiously shallow. Neat, parallel scratches that looked more like a map than a struggle. They looked at the zip ties on her wrists and noticed a level of slack that suggested she could have slipped her hands out at any moment. The monsters Brittany had described were starting to look more like shadows cast by her own hand. The Bethesda bubble hadn't been breached from the outside. The darkness had been invited in, and it was currently sitting in a hospital bed, being hailed as a hero. The investigation into the horrors at Bethesda Row began with a city on edge and a police force operating under the heavy mantle of empathy for a survivor. For the first 48 hours, the Montgomery County Police Department treated the Lululemon boutique as a crime scene breached by external predators. They scoured the alleyways for discarded masks. They pulled grainy footage from every traffic camera within a 5-mile radius. And they looked for a dark van that Brittany Norwood had described with such haunting specificity. But as the forensic specialists moved from the broad strokes of the survivor's tale to the microscopic reality of the evidence, the narrative of the two masked intruders began to dissolve like a ghost in the morning light. The first major fracture in the facade appeared under the harsh glow of the forensics lab. Detectives were haunted by the size 14 shoe prints that Brittany had used to illustrate the presence of a large, aggressive male. While the prints were clearly visible in the blood-slicked hallways, their physics made no sense. A man standing 6 feet tall with a size 14 foot has a natural stride length, a distance between steps that reflects his height and weight. However, the prints in the store suggested an intruder with a remarkably short, choppy gait, one that perfectly matched the stride of a 5'5" woman. Furthermore, the trail of blood was suspiciously one way. In a genuine struggle involving two large men, footprints would be chaotic, overlapping, and tracking blood toward the exits. These prints were clinical, almost as if someone had carefully placed them to tell a story rather than leaving them in a panic. When investigators searched the back of the store, they found the smoking gun tucked away in a storage bin, a pair of men's display sneakers soaked in Jayna Murray's blood on the soles, but dry on the inside. Then there was the matter of the forgotten wallet. Brittany had claimed that she and Jayna returned to the store at 10:05 p.m. because she had left her wallet inside. However, when police searched Brittany's car, which was parked blocks away, they found her wallet sitting in plain sight on the passenger seat. This discrepancy turned a mistake into a calculated lie. Why would someone beg a coworker to reopen a store for a wallet they already had in their possession? The answer pointed toward a lure, a trap designed to get Jayna into a controlled, private environment. The thermal and auditory evidence from the neighboring Apple store provided the final, chilling nail in the coffin. Detectives returned to the two employees who had heard the sounds of the struggle through the wall. Under more intense questioning, the employees clarified a detail that Brittany hadn't accounted for. They didn't hear a chorus of voices. They didn't hear the deep, commanding shouts of two men. They heard one voice, high-pitched and desperate, pleading for mercy, and another voice that remained terrifyingly silent. The sounds of the thuds didn't suggest a group assault. They suggested a rhythmic, singular obsession. As the forensic report on Brittany's own injuries came back, the survivor status was officially revoked. The medical examiner noted that the scratches on Brittany's arms were perfectly parallel, spaced in a way that suggested they were made by someone holding a tool with a steady hand, rather than a victim thrashing in a dark hallway. The sexual assault she described left no physical markers, no DNA from an unknown male, and no evidence of the struggle she claimed had occurred in the bathroom. The only DNA found under Jayna's fingernails evidence of her final, heroic fight for life, belonged to Brittany Norwood. The pivot in the investigation culminated in a high-stakes, multi-hour interrogation that mirrored the psychological intensity of a stage play. Detectives moved from being Brittany's protectors to her prosecutors. They presented her with the footprints. They showed her the photos of her own car. And they asked her to explain why her blood-stained clothes were found hidden in a bag that only she had access to. Brittany's demeanor shifted from traumatized victim to a woman of stony, unyielding silence. She didn't break. She didn't weep. She simply stared into the middle distance, her golden girl mask finally slipping to reveal the cold, predatory pragmatism underneath. On March 18, 2011, just 1 week after the community had rallied around her as a hero, Brittany Norwood was arrested. The charge wasn't just murder, it was first-degree murder. The detectives had realized that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a meticulously staged execution, carried out by a woman who valued her retail reputation more than a human life. The masked men of Bethesda Row were officially declared a fiction, and the survivor was revealed to be the very monster the town had been terrified of. The trial of Brittany Norwood transformed the Montgomery County Circuit Court into a theater of the macabre, where the polished image of a survivor was systematically dismantled. Prosecutors presented the jury with a visceral reconstruction of the 331 wounds, arguing that such an exhaustive level of violence was not a crime of passion, but a determined effort to silence a witness. The defense attempted to argue for a lesser charge of second-degree murder, suggesting a mental breakdown, but the evidence of the cold-blooded staging was insurmountable. The size 14 footprints and the forgotten wallet were not the actions of a woman in a frenzy. They were the actions of a master manipulator. On November 2, 2011, the jury required less than 2 hours to reach their decision, guilty of first-degree murder. At her sentencing, the judge spared no words, describing the crime as one of the most calculating and cold-blooded acts in the history of the county. Brittany Norwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, the glass storefront at Bethesda Row remains a place of commerce. But the community has never truly forgotten the silence of that Saturday morning. Jayna Murray's family established a foundation in her name, funding scholarships and promoting the adventurous, brilliant life she was meant to lead. Brittany Norwood remains in the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women, the Golden Girl athlete, whose ultimate legacy is a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a practiced smile. In a town built on ambition, the Lululemon murder remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't a stranger in the alley. It's the person holding the door open for you, smiling, waiting for the lights to go out. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A simple plastic water bottle sat on the nightstand next to Lynn Hernan's lifeless body in her Pewaukee home. To the responding officers in October 2018, it looked like a tragic, quiet suicide. But inside that clear liquid was a chemical signature that transformed a refreshing drink into a precision-engineered weapon. Jessie Kerchevsky didn't use a gun or a knife to erase her friend. She used 6 bottles of common eye drops. A substance meant to clear redness became the tool for a slow, agonizing shutdown of the human nervous system, delivered by the very person Lynn trusted most. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. In the quiet, manicured pockets of Pewaukee, Wisconsin, Lynn Hernan was a woman who had mastered the art of stability. A life built on the steady hum of a blow dryer and the rhythmic snip of shears. For decades, she had operated as a fixture in the local community, a beautician who didn't just style hair, but served as a silent confessor for her long-term clients. She was 62 years old in the autumn of 2018 living in a comfortable condo that reflected a lifetime of disciplined saving. A woman who never married and never had children of her own, but who found a different kind of fulfillment in her independence. Friends described her as the quintessential frugal professional, someone who would pinch pennies on a grocery bill but wouldn't hesitate to offer the coat off her back if a loved one was shivering. She was wealthy by local standards, though you wouldn't know it by looking at her. She lived modestly, her wealth tucked away in bank accounts that she assumed were her fortress for the future. However, the vibrant, energetic woman who once commanded the floor of her salon began to fade as her health took a sharp, inexplicable turn. For years, stretching back as far as the early 90s, Lynn had battled a constellation of chronic pain, but the final 24 months of her life were marked by a much more aggressive decline. She suffered from lung disease and high blood pressure, but it was the severe, undiagnosed gastrointestinal issues that truly eroded her spirit. She spent her days oscillating between hospital visits and the four walls of her home, growing increasingly frustrated as doctor after doctor failed to provide a concrete diagnosis for the fire in her stomach. By September 2018, she had just returned from a grueling 2-week stint in the hospital, her body weakened and her world shrinking down to the size of her living room recliner. It was in this vacuum of vulnerability that Jessie Kerchevsky solidified her place as the indispensable center of Lynn's universe. Jessie was not a stranger, she was a legacy. As the daughter of Lynn's closest lifelong friend, Jessie had been in Lynn's orbit since she was a toddler, often described by the older woman as the daughter she never had. To the outside world, and certainly to Lynn, Jessie was a godsend. A young woman who had stepped up to manage the messy, exhausting reality of full-time caregiving for a woman who could no longer fetch her own water or manage her own prescriptions. But beneath this veneer of altruistic devotion lay a history that Lynn was never meant to discover. Jessie had been released from prison in 2016 after serving time for forgery and identity theft, a predatory resume that made her the most dangerous person to have access to a sick woman's checkbook. As Lynn's health plummeted, Jessie didn't just provide care, she provided isolation. She became the gatekeeper, the one who answered the phone, the one who interpreted Lynn's needs to the rest of the world, and most crucially, the one who held the keys to Lynn's financial kingdom. While Lynn sat in her recliner, struggling to catch her breath and wondering why her body was betraying her, Jessie was allegedly busy at the keyboard. Prosecutors would later detail a staggering campaign of financial vampirism. Between 2016 and the day of Lynn's death, more than $130,000 vanished from a single money market account. Credit cards were opened in Lynn's name. Loans were secured using her sterling reputation, and her once impeccable credit score began to bleed out alongside her physical health. To Lynn, Jessie was the only person she could trust as her world turned gray. But to Jessie, Lynn was a terminal resource, a woman whose true value wouldn't be realized until the heart in her chest finally stopped beating. The bond between Jessie Kerchevsky and Lynn Hernan was rooted in a generational loyalty that should have been unbreakable. Jessie was the daughter of Lynn's closest friend, a girl Lynn had watched grow from a toddler into a woman, often referring to her with the affectionate title of goddaughter. In the social fabric of Pewaukee, their relationship was seen as a beautiful example of chosen family. Lynn, who had no children of her own, poured her maternal instincts into Jessie, treating her with a level of trust that few biological parents ever achieve. But as Lynn's physical health began to crumble in 2016, that trust became the very aperture through which Jessie would begin to drain her life's work. When Lynn's medical needs transitioned from occasional check-ins to the requirement of a full-time presence, Jessie didn't just volunteer. She moved in like a tactical force, positioning herself as the sole barrier between the ailing woman and the rest of the world. As the self-appointed caregiver, Jessie's role was meticulously constructed to look like total devotion. She was the one who braved the Wisconsin winters to handle the grocery shopping. She was the one who sat by the bed during the long, nauseating afternoons following Lynn's hospital stays. And most importantly, she was the one who took over the burden of Lynn's finances. To a woman who was increasingly frail and struggling with the mental fog of chronic illness, this seemed like a mercy. Lynn handed over her checkbook, her passwords, and her credit cards, believing that she was empowering a loved one to protect her. In reality, she was handing a seasoned fraudster the blueprints to her own destruction. Records would later reveal that Jesse had been released from prison just as Lynn's health began its final steep decline, a timing that felt less like a coincidence and more like a predator identifying a wounded target. The financial vampirism that followed was staggering in its breadth and cold-blooded execution. While Lynn sat in her recliner, wondering why her stomach felt like it was filled with glass, Jesse was allegedly orchestrating a theft that totaled exactly $290,210.06. This wasn't a one-time heist, it was a persistent, daily bleeding of assets that spanned over 2 years. Jesse became an expert at the paperwork of betrayal. She began writing checks to herself from Lynn's accounts, but she was careful to leave a trail of lies in the memo lines to avoid immediate suspicion, marking payments as IRS, property tax, or car payment to make the massive outflows look like the mundane expenses of a wealthy senior. While Lynn's money market account was being systematically hollowed out, her credit score, once a point of pride, was being decimated by maxed out cards and high-interest loans that Jesse secured in her name without her knowledge. The cruelty of the relationship was most visible in the psychological isolation Jesse enforced. As Lynn became worth more dead than alive to her caregiver, Jesse began to prune away Lynn's other social connections. Longtime friends who called to check on Auntie Linny were met with a wall of hostility from Jesse, who would mouth off into the receiver, telling them never to call again and that Lynn was too sick to be bothered. She convinced Lynn that her friends had abandoned her, that her family didn't care about her pain, and that Jesse was the only person left in her corner. This manufactured loneliness served a dual purpose. It ensured that no one would notice the missing money, and it made Lynn entirely dependent on the person who was slowly poisoning her. Even as Lynn began to voice her own confusion, telling the few people she could still reach that her money was disappearing and she couldn't understand where it was going, Jesse doubled down on the gaslighting. She would comfort the woman she was robbing, holding her hand while simultaneously planning the next withdrawal. The dynamic was a chilling dance of predator and prey, where every act of care, the cool cloth on the forehead, the glass of water brought to the bedside, was part of a larger lethal performance. Jessie Kerchevsky wasn't just a caregiver. She was a financial assassin who understood that to get away with the ultimate crime, she first had to erase the victim's ability to ask for help. The morning of October 3rd, 2018, began with a deceptive stillness that settled over the manicured lawns of Pewaukee. Inside the condo on Applewood Court, the air was thick with the clinical scent of rubbing alcohol and the stale, heavy odor of long-term illness. Lynn Hernan lay in her favorite recliner, the piece of furniture that had become her entire world over the last several weeks, while the television hummed in the background, a low-volume drone that provided the only heartbeat in the room. She was 62 years old, her body exhausted by a mysterious, grinding ailment that refused to let go. To her, the young woman moving efficiently through the kitchen was her only lifeline. She didn't see a predator, she saw a daughter. She didn't see the end. She saw a caregiver bringing her a bottle of water to ease the fire in her throat. Jessie Kerchevsky was not just a guest in the house that day. She was the architect of its atmosphere. While Lynn drifted in and out of a medicated fog, Jessie was allegedly engaged in a task that required a terrifying level of focus. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden, explosive outburst. It was a laboratory experiment in human termination. The weapon didn't need to be hidden under a floorboard or smuggled in a dark coat. It was purchased in the healthcare aisle of a local pharmacy, sitting in plain sight on the kitchen counter. 6 small, translucent bottles of common eye drops, Visine. The process was agonizingly slow. Jessie didn't just dump the liquid. She had to ensure it was a lethal concentration. Each bottle was opened, the safety seal snapped with a clinical precision, and the contents were squeezed, drop by drop, into a single plastic water bottle. The active ingredient, tetrahydrozoline, is a decongestant meant to constrict blood vessels in the eyes. But when ingested in massive quantities, it becomes a potent neurotoxin. It's a chemical that targets the central nervous system, forcing the blood pressure to plummet, the heart rate to stall, and the respiratory system to simply stop. In that kitchen, the sound of the plastic bottle being squeezed was the only warning Lynn Hernan would ever receive. Jessie brought the water to the recliner. She told the investigators later that she was just helping Lynn with what she wanted, a narrative of assisted suicide that she would cling to like a life raft. She watched as Lynn took the bottle. She watched as the clear, tainted liquid was swallowed. There was no immediate reaction, no gasping, no dramatic struggle. Instead, there was a slow, terrifying descent into a coma-like state. For hours, Jessie allegedly sat in that house, waiting for the chemistry to do its work. She didn't call for help when Lynn's breathing became shallow. She didn't reach for the phone when the older woman's skin began to grow cold. She waited, meticulously observing the transition from a living person to a biological obstacle. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Jessie pivoted from the role of executioner to that of a stage manager. She knew that a sudden death in a recliner would draw questions, so she began to construct a scene. She gathered a stash of Lynn's prescription medications, a cocktail of painkillers and sedatives, and began to crush them. She didn't want the autopsy to find only eye drops. She wanted the world to believe that Lynn Hernan had finally given up. She scattered the white powder across Lynn's chest and onto the small table nearby, making it look like a desperate final act of a woman in pain. She adjusted the body, ensuring the water bottle was close enough to be noticed, but not so close as to look planted. Every M- of life was being erased, replaced by a fraudulent period. At 5:15 p.m., the performance officially began. Jessie dialed 911. Her voice, captured on the recorded line, was a masterpiece of manufactured panic. She told the dispatcher that she had just arrived and found her friend unresponsive. She shrieked that Lynn wasn't breathing. She played the part of the traumatized daughter, her breathing heavy, her words clipped and jagged. When the first responders arrived minutes later, they found a scene that looked exactly like what Jessie had designed. A sick woman, a recliner, a pile of pills, and a grieving caregiver who seemed unable to comprehend the tragedy. The paramedics declared Lynn dead at the scene. They noted the white powder on her chest and the lack of trauma to the body. They saw a woman who had been struggling for years and assumed the struggle had simply become too much to bear. The police officers on the scene spoke to Jessie in soft, sympathetic tones. She told them she had been out running errands and had returned to find the house silent. She played on their empathy, using her long history with Lynn to establish herself as a victim of grief. But as the officers began their initial walkthrough, a few things didn't quite sit right. The way the powder was distributed, sitting on top of the clothes rather than being swallowed, seemed odd to one detective. The sheer volume of the suicide kit seemed a bit too cinematic, a bit too deliberate. And then there was Jessie herself. Even in her grief, she seemed oddly focused on Lynn's belongings, her eyes darting toward the paperwork on the desk. The local community in Pewaukee would soon hear that Lynn Hernan had passed away peacefully in her sleep. But in the quiet corners of the police station, the first seeds of suspicion were already beginning to sprout. The water bottle was taken into evidence, not as a murder weapon, but as a routine item from a suicide scene, a mistake that almost allowed a predator to walk free with nearly $300,000 of blood money. For the residents of Pewaukee, the weeks following Lynn Hernan's death were shrouded in a quiet, neighborly grief. The community had accepted the initial narrative. A sick woman, exhausted by chronic pain, had finally succumbed to her ailments or taken a desperate exit. There was a funeral, a scattering of memories, and the slow process of settling an estate. But while the surface of the town remained calm, a storm was brewing inside the Waukesha County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Linda Biedrzycki, the medical examiner tasked with determining why a 62-year-old woman would suddenly expire in her recliner, was staring at a laboratory report that defied every standard medical expectation. The scene at the condo had been a textbook staging of an overdose: crushed pills, scattered bottles, and a powdery residue. But the blood work told a far more sinister story. Initial screenings for common narcotics and sedatives came back within expected ranges, but there was an anomaly in the toxicology screen that demanded a closer look. A substance had been detected that was never intended to cross the blood-brain barrier. It was tetrahydrozoline, the active chemical compound found in over-the-counter eye drops like Vicine. To the layperson, eye drops are a harmless household staple, a cooling relief for seasonal allergies or a late night. But to a forensic toxicologist, tetrahydrozoline is a potent vasoconstrictor. When applied to the eye, it shrinks blood vessels to reduce redness. When ingested, however, it becomes a systemic poison. It attacks the central nervous system with the precision of a surgical strike, mimicking the effects of a severe clonidine overdose. It forces the heart rate to slow to a crawl, causes blood pressure to plummet to lethally low levels, and induces a profound respiratory depression that eventually starves the brain of oxygen. In Lynn Hernan's system, the concentration of this chemical was not just present, it was astronomical. It was at levels that could not be explained by accidental ingestion or even a heavy hand with a dropper. Dr. Biedrzycki's findings were clear. The tetrahydrozoline had to have been ingested in a massive, concentrated dose. The science suggested that someone had emptied multiple bottles, later estimated by prosecutors to be as many as 6, into a single container of water. This revelation fundamentally shifted the nature of the investigation. Lynn Hernan hadn't died of a broken heart or a failure of her lungs. She had been chemically executed. The medical examiner officially ruled the death a homicide, a decision that sent shockwaves through the local police department. Suicide scenes are common. Eye drop murders are virtually unheard of. While the lab results were being processed, the grieving daughter figure, Jessie Kerchowski, was displaying a level of anxiety that investigators found increasingly difficult to ignore. Rather than retreating into private mourning, Jessie began a campaign of persistent, almost frantic communication with the medical examiner's office. She didn't just call once to check on the progress, she called multiple times, her voice laced with a great deal of interest and curiosity regarding the specific results of the toxicology report. To the detectives, this wasn't the behavior of a survivor seeking closure. It was the behavior of a perpetrator checking to see if their tracks had been covered. The community's reaction was a slow-motion transformation from sympathy to suspicion. Friends of Lynn, who had initially been silenced by Jessie's gatekeeping, began to emerge from the shadows with their own red flags. They spoke of a lockbox that Lynn kept in her home, a box that was supposed to be filled with emergency cash and valuables, which was found mysteriously empty after her death. They spoke of the strange, aggressive text messages Jessie had sent to anyone trying to visit the condo in the final weeks. The image of the devoted caregiver was beginning to crack, revealing a woman who was less interested in Lynn's health and far more concerned with the timeline of her toxicology results. As the Waukesha County Sheriff's Department began to coordinate with the district attorney's office, the investigation pivoted from the physical scene at the condo to a digital and financial forensic deep dive. They found that around the time Lynn was allegedly committing suicide, her credit score had plummeted to nearly zero. Her bank accounts had been hollowed out, and a fraudulent will had been filed with the circuit court to ensure the remaining assets flowed directly into Jesse's hands. The revelation of the poison was the final piece of the puzzle. The tears that Jesse had shed for the first responders were now being viewed through a different lens, not as the salt of grief, but as a performance designed to mask the cold-blooded reality of a murder for profit. In the quiet town of Pewaukee, the realization was setting in. The most dangerous thing in Lynn Hernan's house hadn't been her failing health. It had been the person holding the water bottle. The air in the interrogation room at the Waukesha County Sheriff's Department was stagnant, a sharp, sterile contrast to the crisp October breeze outside. Across a metal table sat Jessie Kerchevsky, her posture a calculated symphony of a grieving daughter figure and a helpful witness. But the detectives across from her were no longer interested in her comfort. They had the toxicology report, a document that effectively turned a quiet suicide into a chemical execution. When the lead investigator leaned forward and revealed the staggering levels of tetrahydrozoline found in Lynn Hernan's blood, the room didn't explode with a confession. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most complex, frustrating displays of narrative gymnastics in the history of the department. The mask didn't break, it merely adjusted. Jesse's first reaction wasn't shock at the poison, but a rapid, stuttering pivot into a new reality. She told the investigators that she wasn't surprised by the findings because Lynn had been obsessed with eye drops for years. She claimed that Lynn didn't just use them for her eyes. She used them as a sort of homebrewed remedy for her various ailments. She spun a story of Lynn drinking the clear liquid to cleanse her system, suggesting that the massive dose found in her stomach was simply a tragic accident born of a bizarre, long-term habit. It was a classic red herring, a desperate attempt to pathologize the victim and turn the murder weapon into a quirky personal preference. But as the hours ticked by, the interrogation stretching into a grueling marathon of circular logic, the detectives began to pull on the threads of Jesse's financial life. While she was busy explaining Lynn's supposed eye drop addiction, forensic accountants were unearthing a different kind of obsession. They presented Jesse with the reality of the $290,210.06 that had been methodically siphoned from Lynn's life savings. They walked her through the transactions, the checks written to cash, the transfers to Jesse's own accounts, and the high-stakes gambling habits that seemed to align perfectly with the dates the money disappeared. The frustration in the room was palpable as Jesse dismissed the nearly $300,000 hole as nothing more than Lynn's generosity. She claimed that Lynn wanted her to have the money, that she was paying Jesse for her care, and that the luxury items and bank transfers were all sanctioned by a woman who was too sick to even walk to the mailbox. Every time the investigators backed her into a corner with a bank statement, she would pivot again. She suggested that Lynn was losing her mind, or that she was forgetful about the money she had supposedly gifted. This was the midpoint pivot of the investigation, the moment where the detectives realized they weren't dealing with a woman who had made a mistake, but a predator who viewed every question as a game to be won. When the accidental ingestion story failed to gain traction, Jesse moved to her third version of the truth. She shifted the blame to Lynn's mental state, suggesting that Lynn was deeply depressed and had used the eye drops in a previous, unsuccessful suicide attempt. She painted a picture of a woman who was obsessed with death, claiming that Lynn had asked her to find ways to help her go. This was a calculated move to introduce the concept of assisted suicide, a narrative that Jesse believed might carry a lighter sentence than cold-blooded murder. She told the detectives that Lynn was tired of the pain and that she, Jesse, was merely a compassionate soul caught in an impossible situation. The investigators remained stone-faced, pushing back against the logic of using 6 bottles of Visine for a suicide when the house was already filled with potent, lethal prescription painkillers. If Lynn wanted to end her life, why would she choose a slow, agonizing chemical shutdown over the pills already sitting on her nightstand? Jesse's 4th version emerged from this pressure. She claimed that Lynn didn't like the feeling of the pills and preferred the water bottle method. By the 8th hour of questioning, the exhaustion had stripped away the last of Jesse's composure. The 5th version was a haunting admission that sent a chill through the room. She confessed that she had been the one to bring the water bottle to Lynn. She admitted that she had watched as the suicide bottle, the one she claimed Lynn had prepared herself, sat on the table. Then, in a final jagged pivot, she admitted to helping her friend by handing her the bottle, knowing exactly what was inside it. She described the act as a mercy, a way to end Lynn's suffering, all while maintaining that she hadn't actually poured the drops herself. The detectives watched as she finally trapped herself in her own web. She had gone from, "I found her like that," to, "I handed her the poison," in the span of a single day. The red herrings she had thrown, the claims of Lynn's insanity, the accusations against other friends, the stories of a secret eye drop habit, had all evaporated under the heat of the forensic evidence. They had her on record admitting to the delivery of a lethal dose. They had the paper trail showing she had hollowed out a dying woman's life for nearly $300,000. The frustration of the detectives finally broke into a grim realization. Jesse Kerchevsky didn't kill Lynn Hernan to end her pain. She killed her because Lynn was finally starting to notice the money was gone, and a dead woman can't testify about a stolen fortune. The courtroom in late 2023 became the final stage for Jesse Kerchevsky's years-long performance. For weeks, the jury was forced to reconcile 2 vastly different images: the loving caregiver Jesse claimed to be, and the calculated financial vampire the evidence revealed. Prosecutors meticulously linked the disappearance of $290,210 to the exact timing of the poisoning, arguing that the motive wasn't mercy, it was math. The defense's claim of assisted suicide crumbled under the weight of the forensic accounting. Why would a woman who wanted to die allow her best friend to systematically loot her estate first? In November, the jury delivered their answer: guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of theft. The finality arrived in April 2024, when the judge handed down a sentence of life in prison. Jesse would have to serve at least 30 years before even being eligible for parole, a 3-decade debt for a life stolen with 6 bottles of eye drops. The silence in the Pewaukee condo is now absolute, a quiet earned not through peace, but through cold, chemical erasure. Lynn Hernan died believing she was being cradled by the daughter she never had, unaware she was being liquidated like an unwanted asset. Trust is a fragile currency, and in Jesse Kerchevsky's hands, it was spent until only an empty account and a tainted bottle remained. It is a chilling, grounded reminder the most dangerous person in the room isn't always the one with a gun. Sometimes, it's the one simply offering you a drink. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A black Ford F-150 sits idling in a deserted Kmart parking lot, its cabin slowly filling with an invisible, odorless poison. Inside, an 18-year-old boy is losing his final battle with the air, but he isn't alone. Miles away, a teenage girl watches her phone screen glow in the dark, her thumbs moving with chilling, surgical precision. She isn't calling for help. She isn't begging him to stop. Instead, she is typing the words that will seal his fate, commanding him to return to the fumes. This is a homicide with no physical struggle, only a trail of blue text and a lethal digital ultimatum. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Mattapoisett, Massachusetts is a place defined by the rhythmic pull of the Atlantic, a coastal town where the air stays thick with the scent of brine and the legacy of seafaring families. This was the world of Conrad Roy III, a young man whose very name carried the weight of 3 generations of expectations. To those standing on the shore, Conrad was the quintessential success story. He was a high honors student with a 3.9 GPA, a versatile athlete, and a newly minted tugboat captain who had just earned his professional license from the Northeast Maritime Institute. His future appeared as vast and open as the horizon he navigated every day. But beneath the polished surface of his achievements, a different kind of tide was pulling him under. The Roy family legacy was built on marine salvage, a gritty, demanding business of hauling the broken remains of ships from the ocean floor. Conrad spent his summers on the water, working alongside his father and grandfather, learning that survival depended on strength and silence. Yet inside the cabin of his own mind, the machinery was failing. He struggled with a crushing social anxiety that made every interaction feel like a performance, and a depression that had begun to calcify into something immovable. By 2012, the cracks had become visible. At just 18 years old, he attempted to end his life by swallowing a massive quantity of acetaminophen. He survived that day, but the attempt left him tethered to a world he no longer felt he belonged to, a world where he felt misunderstood by the very people who loved him most. 30 miles inland, in the quiet, manicured suburb of Plainville, Michelle Carter was navigating a vastly different psychological landscape. On paper, she was the all-American girl, the daughter of a successful sales manager, a member of the school's cross-country team, and a girl whose social media was a curated gallery of smiles and friendship bracelets. But the image was a hollow shell. Michelle existed in a state of perpetual social hunger, a desperate, almost pathological need to be the center of someone's narrative. While Conrad was trying to disappear into the fog of his own thoughts, Michelle was terrified of being invisible. Her life was a series of intense, short-lived obsessions. She suffered from a severe eating disorder that saw her hospitalized at the McLean facility, a place where she began to learn the vocabulary of trauma and mental illness, words she would later use as tools. In the halls of King Philip Regional High School, Michelle was known, but not truly known. She was the girl who would send dozens of texts to classmates, begging for a chance to hang out, only to be met with polite excuses or silence. Her peers later described her as the girl who tried too hard, an outsider who desperately wanted to be the best friend in a group that didn't really have room for her. She found solace in the melodramatic worlds of young adult fiction and television shows like Glee, internalizing the idea that tragedy was the ultimate form of validation, that being the grieving loved one was a role that guaranteed the attention she craved. The intersection of these two fractured lives occurred by chance in February 2012. While both families were visiting relatives in Naples, Florida, Conrad and Michelle met on a sun-drenched beach. It was a brief, physical encounter, a few days of bike rides and teenage flirting under the palm trees. In person, they were almost strangers, but once they returned to their respective towns in Massachusetts, their relationship transformed into something far more potent. Separated by a mere 30-minute drive, they rarely saw each other in the flesh. Instead, they built a fortress made of digital signals, a world constructed entirely of blue bubbles and midnight confessions. For the next 2 years, their bond became a closed-circuit feedback loop of mutual despair. Conrad found in Michelle a person who didn't tell him to just cheer up, but who instead validated his darkness. Michelle found in Conrad the one person who truly needed her, the audience she'd been searching for her entire life. They exchanged thousands of messages, often staying awake until the early hours of the morning, dissecting their shared isolation. To Conrad, Michelle was his anchor in a storm he couldn't escape. To Michelle, Conrad was a project, a boy whose pain gave her a sense of purpose and a degree of control she lacked in her own life. As Conrad's mental health continued to deteriorate through 2013 and into 2014, the digital tether between them tightened, pulling them both toward a precipice that neither was prepared to navigate alone. The digital tether between Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy was not merely a convenience. It was a sanctuary, a vacuum-sealed environment where the laws of reality and the consequences of the physical world seemed not to apply. After their brief encounter on that Florida beach in 2012, they returned to a Massachusetts landscape that felt smaller and more suffocating than before. Despite living only 50 miles apart, a mere 45-minute drive along Interstate 495, they existed in a state of near total physical isolation from one another. Over the course of their 2-year relationship, they saw each other in person no more than 5 times. Their intimacy was not built on touch or shared experiences in the sunlight. It was forged in the pale, flickering blue light of smartphone screens during the loneliest hours of the night. This was a romance of the digital age, a virtual bond in the truest sense of the word. In the absence of physical presence, their text messages became their entire reality. The sheer volume of their correspondence was staggering. More than 60,000 messages were exchanged, a relentless stream of consciousness that functioned as a closed-circuit feedback loop. In this private, encrypted world, they didn't have to be the successful tugboat captain or the popular cross-country runner. They were allowed to be broken. They were allowed to be dark. Conrad found in Michelle a confidant who didn't just listen to his suicidal ideations, but seemed to cherish them, treating his pain as a profound, poetic secret that only the two of them could truly understand. For Michelle, the relationship served a darker, more complex psychological need. She was a girl who lived on the periphery of her own social circles, always looking in, always performing. Through Conrad, she found a way to be the protagonist of a grand, tragic narrative. She didn't just want a boyfriend, she wanted a role to play. In the thousands of messages they sent, she began to craft a persona for herself as the tireless caretaker, the only person who could save the boy who didn't want to be saved. She would tell him that she was the only one who truly cared about his soul, effectively alienating him from his family and his doctors by framing their help as a misunderstanding of his true nature. As 2013 bled into 2014, the tone of their correspondence began to shift in a way that would eventually become lethal. Initially, Michelle had acted as a deterrent, frequently texting Conrad to seek professional help or to think of his family when he spoke of ending his life. But something changed in the early summer of 2014. Whether it was a desire to finally see the tragedy through to its conclusion or a twisted attempt to secure her place. As the grieving widow she had seen in her favorite television shows, Michelle stopped being the anchor and started being the current. She began to treat his death not as a possibility to be feared, but as an inevitability to be managed. The digital record reveals a chilling transition into what can only be described as a managerial role. She began to help him research methods, discussing the logistics of various lethal gases and the seclusion of different parking lots with the cold efficiency of an event planner. She told him that his family would eventually understand, that they would be sad for a while, but would ultimately find peace knowing he was no longer suffering. She framed his self-destruction as a form of liberation, a beautiful exit from a world that didn't deserve him. This wasn't a conversation between two lovers, it was a grooming process. Michelle seemed to be obsessed with the aesthetic of the star-crossed lover. She drew inspiration from the musical Glee, specifically the real-life death of actor Corey Monteith and the grief of his co-star Lea Michele. She would later be found to have sent Conrad's mother messages that almost verbatim mirrored the dialogue from the show, casting herself in the role of the tragic, loyal partner. In the digital vacuum they created, Michelle became the primary architect of Conrad's reality. She convinced him that his previous failed attempts were merely a lack of resolve, and that this time, with her support, he could finally find the peace he claimed to seek. The relationship also served as a shield for Michelle's own insecurities. While she was directing Conrad's life toward a cliff, she was simultaneously using his crisis to garner sympathy from her own peers. She would text her school friends, claiming that Conrad was missing or that she was terrified for his life, often at moments when she knew exactly where he was. She was testing the waters of grief, seeing how much attention a tragedy would bring her before the tragedy had even occurred. To Conrad, she was his only hope. To the rest of the world, she was a concerned girlfriend. But to the investigators who would eventually unlock her phone, she was a girl playing a high-stakes game of life and death with a boy who was too fragile to see the strings. By July 2014, the playing house aspect of their relationship had reached a fever pitch. They spoke of being together in the afterlife, of a world where their mental illnesses wouldn't keep them apart. Michelle's messages became increasingly impatient, almost berating him when he expressed hesitation or fear. She told him that he was constantly making excuses and that he needed to just do it. The digital world they had built was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a cage, and Michelle Carter held the only key. She had spent 2 years becoming the most important voice in his head, and now she was using that voice to tell him that the only way to prove his love for her and his own strength was to die. The physical distance between Plainville and Mattapoisett remained a short drive, but the psychological distance Michelle had created between Conrad and the rest of the world was immeasurable. He was alone in a room full of people, tethered only to the vibration in his pocket. Every time the screen lit up, it was Michelle, reminding him of his promise, reminding him that she was waiting for him to be happy, in the way only a ghost could be. The digital landscape was fully prepped, the narrative was written. All that remained was for the lead actor to take his place on the stage she had so meticulously set. Michelle Carter was no longer suggesting, she was managing. From her bedroom in Plainville, she spent the day acting as a technical consultant for a death she had spent weeks helping him curate. When Conrad expressed a flicker of hesitation, mentioning that he was having a good day with his family, Michelle didn't offer him a way out. Instead, she offered him a deadline. She told him that he couldn't keep pushing it off, that he had promised her he was ready, and that if he didn't follow through now, he never would. Her messages throughout the afternoon took on a tone of frustrated logistics. She questioned why he hadn't found a secluded spot yet, and she berated him for his perceived cowardice, telling him that his family would get over his loss in a matter of weeks. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Conrad made his final moves. He drove his truck to a Fairhaven Kmart parking lot, a sprawling, unremarkable expanse of asphalt that, at that hour, was largely deserted. He chose a spot far from the store's entrance, near the edge of the lot where the shadows were deepest. It was a location they had discussed, a place where he could be alone, but where he would eventually be found. He stayed in constant contact with Michelle, his thumbs moving across the screen in a desperate rhythm. He told her he was scared. He told her he didn't know if he could go through with it. Michelle's response was a digital shove. She told him that he was overthinking, that the pain would be over in an instant, and that he needed to be brave for her. The technical execution of the act was as crude as it was effective. Conrad moved the water pump from the bed of the truck into the cab. He started the engine. The small gasoline-powered motor began to hum, a mechanical intrusion into the quiet Fairhaven night. Almost immediately, the cabin began to fill with carbon monoxide, a silent, colorless gas that began to displace the oxygen he needed to survive. As the fumes thickened, the physical reality of what he was doing finally collided with the abstract plan they had spent so long building. The instinct to survive, the primal, biological urge to breathe, overwhelmed the psychological conditioning Michelle had provided. Conrad opened the door. He stepped out of the truck and into the cool, salt-scented air of the parking lot. He was coughing, his head spinning, his body rejecting the poison he had invited in. This was the moment where the tragedy could have ended, the moment where life could have won. He called Michelle. They spoke for 43 minutes. During that call, Conrad told her that he had gotten out. He told her he was frightened and that the gas was making him sick. In that 43-minute window, Michelle Carter had every opportunity to change the narrative. She could have called his parents. She could have called the Fairhaven police. She could have simply told him to stay out of the truck and walk away. But the digital script she had written required a finale. She didn't offer comfort. According to her own later admission to a friend, she told him to get back in. She used the authority she had cultivated over 2 years to override his survival instinct. She told him that he was making a scene, that he had already made his decision, and that he needed to finish what he started. She spoke to him not as a lover, but as a commanding officer. Under the weight of her voice, Conrad Roy III, a boy who had spent his life trying to live up to the expectations of others, obeyed one last command. He climbed back into the driver's seat. He closed the door. He sat in the dark as the hum of the water pump continued, and he waited for the end. Michelle didn't hang up. She stayed on the line, listening to the sound of his breathing change. She listened as the coughing subsided and was replaced by the silence of a life being extinguished. She sat in the safety of her own home, miles away, tethered to his death by a radio signal. When the line finally went quiet, she didn't call for help. She didn't alert his mother, who was only a few miles away, wondering why her son hadn't come home yet. Instead, Michelle went to sleep, knowing that her role as the grieving widow was about to begin. The Fairhaven Kmart remained still. The black truck sat idling until the gasoline in the pump finally ran out, leaving the cabin filled with a lethal concentration of carbon monoxide. Inside, Conrad Roy lay slumped against the door, his phone resting near his hand. The screen now dark, the final messages of his life preserved in a digital amber that would eventually become his only testament. Michelle's behavior in the hours following the incident was as calculated as the act itself. Before the sun rose on Sunday morning, she began reaching out to his family, not to tell them what she had done, but to play the part of the frantic, worried girlfriend. She sent messages to Conrad's mother and sisters, asking if they had seen him, feigning a panic that was entirely manufactured. She was establishing her alibi, building the foundation of a story where she was a victim of a tragedy she had personally overseen. She was already practicing her grief, refining the performance she would give to the world, a performance that relied on the assumption that no one would ever look inside the phone that was currently sitting in a police evidence locker in the Fairhaven parking lot. The why of that night remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It wasn't about hate, and it wasn't about a mercy killing. It was about the transformation of a human being into a prop for someone else's melodrama. Michelle Carter needed Conrad to die so that she could finally be seen. She needed the funeral. She needed the sympathy. She needed the public mourning. She had spent years being the girl who was ignored, and she discovered that the quickest way to become a protagonist was to create a tragedy. On the night of July 12th, the Fairhaven parking lot wasn't a crime scene to her. It was a stage, and Conrad Roy III was the only person who didn't know he was playing a part until the air ran out. Conrad's final hours with his family were a masterclass in the masks we wear. He sat at the dinner table, eating with his mother and sisters, participating in a conversation about the mundane plans of a summer evening. To his mother, Lynn, he seemed slightly distant, perhaps a bit quieter than usual, but there was nothing to signal that he was living his final hour. He had even made plans for the next day, a psychological tactic often used by those who have already decided to leave. A way to ensure the path remains clear and unobstructed by the intervention of loved ones. After dinner, he told his mother he was going out. He didn't say where, he didn't say why. He simply walked out the door, climbed into his truck, and drove toward Fairhaven. During that drive, the messages from Michelle were a constant rhythmic presence. She was checking in, ensuring he was on track, making sure he hadn't changed his mind. She spoke of the peace he would find, of how proud she was of him for making this choice. She framed his suicide as an act of maturity and strength, effectively weaponizing his own insecurities against him. When he arrived at the Kmart, he didn't immediately set up the equipment. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine of the truck turned off, the silence of the parking lot pressing in on him. This was the moment of the great hesitation. He messaged her, telling her that the lot was empty and that he was scared. A true friend, a true lover, would have used that fear as a lifeline. Michelle used it as a pivot. She told him that the emptiness was a sign, a perfect opportunity that he shouldn't waste. She reminded him that he had everything he needed, and that the longer he waited, the more likely he was to lose his nerve. She was effectively gilling him, a psychological term for keeping a victim on the hook, providing just enough tension to prevent them from swimming away. Every time he pulled back, she reeled him in with a combination of guilt and false promises of relief. By the time he actually moved the pump into the cabin, he was operating less out of a desire to die and more out of a desperate need to satisfy her expectations. He had spent his life trying to please his father, his grandfather, and his teachers. Now, in the final hour of his life, he was trying to please Michelle. The sound of the pump starting up must have been deafening in the small space of the truck's cab. It was a two-stroke engine designed for heavy labor, not for the silent work of a suicide. The vibrations would have rattled the dashboard, the smell of gasoline filling the air even before the exhaust began to build. It was a violent, mechanical way to go, far from the peaceful drifting off to sleep that Michelle had promised him. When he stood in that parking lot, gasping for air, the world around him was still moving. He was a phone call away from being saved, but when he dialed Michelle, he wasn't calling for a rescue. He was calling his director to tell her that he had missed his cue. And she, with the cold clarity of someone who has already moved on to the next scene, told him to go back and finish the performance. This command, the "get back in," that would define the entire legal case, was the ultimate betrayal of the digital sanctuary they had built. It stripped away the pretense of love and revealed the skeletal structure of her control. She needed him to be dead more than she needed him to be happy. And so he went back. He went back because, in his fractured mind, her voice had become the only truth he had left. He sat in the rising poison, listening to her voice on the other end of the line, until the poison became stronger than the voice, and the voice became the only thing left in the empty Fairhaven night. The morning sun of July 13th, 2014, rose over the Fairhaven Kmart, casting long, distorted shadows across an almost empty parking lot. It was a local police officer who noticed the black Ford F-150, a silent sentinel parked at the far edge of the asphalt. To a casual observer, it was just a vehicle left overnight, perhaps a traveler resting or a breakdown waiting for a tow. But as the cruiser pulled alongside, the officer noted the condensation on the windows and the faint, lingering scent of combustion that seemed to hang in the stagnant summer air. When he peered through the glass, the mundane reality of the morning shattered. Inside sat an 18-year-old boy, seemingly asleep against the window, his skin a haunting cherry pink hue, the telltale signature of carbon monoxide poisoning. The discovery sent a shockwave through the quiet streets of Mattapoisett. Within hours, the area was cordoned off, but there was no mystery for the first responders to solve. The gasoline-powered water pump was still sitting in the passenger footwell, its fuel tank dry, its work completed. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no external injuries. To the Fairhaven detectives, it was a textbook case of a tragic, self-inflicted end. A young man with a history of depression had finally found a way out. They found a note, brief and filled with a weary finality, and they found his phone. At that moment, no one thought to look for a killer within the digital data. They saw only the wreckage of a fragile mind that had finally snapped. While the Roy family was being hollowed out by a grief that was private, silent, and absolute, 30 miles away in Plainville, Michelle Carter was beginning a very different process. The moment the news was confirmed, the anchor she had claimed to be transformed into a professional mourner. She didn't retreat into the shadows of her bedroom to process the loss of the boy she supposedly loved. She stepped into the spotlight. Within 24 hours, her social media presence became a curated museum of their relationship. She began posting photos of Conrad, many from their brief time in Florida years prior, accompanied by long tributes that painted their bond as an epic, star-crossed romance that the world was too cruel to sustain. She began to reach out to Conrad's mother, Lynn, with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. She sent messages expressing a level of intimacy and shared history that didn't quite match the reality of their 2-year, text-based distance. Michelle told Lynn that she was Conrad's soulmate, claiming they had shared secrets and plans for a future that only she truly understood. She positioned herself as the keeper of his legacy, a self-appointed secondary daughter who was there to guide the Roy family through their darkness. In the eyes of a grieving mother, Michelle appeared to be a gift, a living connection to the son she had just lost. Lynn had no reason to suspect that the girl offering her comfort was the same person who had spent the final 43 minutes of Conrad's life ensuring he didn't change his mind. The performance grew in scale and ambition. Michelle didn't just want to be the grieving girlfriend in private. She wanted a public audience. She began to organize a charitable softball tournament in his name, calling it Homers for Conrad. On the surface, it was an act of selfless devotion, a way to raise money for mental health awareness. But the logistics told a different story. Despite Conrad's entire life, his friends, his teammates, his family, being rooted in Mattapoisett, Michelle insisted on holding the event in her own town of Plainville. When Conrad's actual friends suggested moving the event to a location where those who actually knew him could attend, Michelle was dismissive. She told them that this was her way of honoring him and that the location was non-negotiable. The event became a stage for Michelle's brand of tragedy. She wore a shirt with his name on it. She spoke to the local press, and she basked in the sympathy of a community that saw her as a brave, broken young woman trying to find meaning in a senseless loss. She was finally the protagonist. The peers who had ignored her in the hallways of King Philip Regional High School were now looking at her with awe and pity. She was no longer the girl who tried too hard. She was the girl who had lost everything. This was the validation she had been starving for, a social currency minted from the death of the boy she had commanded to get back in. During the weeks following the funeral, Michelle's behavior became increasingly performative. She would tell her friends that she could still feel Conrad's presence, that he was talking to her from the other side, and that he was happy now. She was effectively writing a sequel to his life, one where she remained the central figure. In her messages to classmates, she would often veer from profound sadness to a strange, morbid excitement about the attention the tragedy was bringing her. She questioned if people were talking about her, if they were worried about her, and if she looked like the kind of person who could survive such a blow. As the summer of 2014 began to fade, the investigation into Conrad's death remained stagnant, categorized as a simple suicide. The Fairhaven police had no reason to dig deeper into a case that seemed so tragically straightforward. But the digital breadcrumbs Michelle was leaving behind, the constant texting, the performative grief, and her own admissions to friends, were starting to create a pattern that even the most sympathetic observer couldn't ignore. She had achieved the spotlight she craved, but in doing so, she had stepped into a circle of light that would eventually reveal the truth. And while Michelle Carter was busy polishing her crown of thorns, the Fairhaven police were finally starting to look closer at the device Conrad Roy had been clutching when the air ran out. They were about to discover that the grieving widow wasn't just a spectator to the tragedy. She was the writer, the director, and the one who had finally given the order for the curtain to fall. The initial closure of Conrad Roy's case as a straightforward suicide lasted only as long as it took for a Fairhaven detective to scroll through the digital remains of his final hours. While the physical evidence at the Kmart parking lot suggested a solitary act of despair, the black smartphone recovered from the scene told a story of a dual occupancy tragedy. When investigators began the forensic extraction of the device, they didn't find a handful of messages. They found an ecosystem. Over 60,000 texts formed a dense, suffocating canopy over the relationship. But it was the activity in the weeks leading up to July 12th that shifted the investigation from a wellness check to a criminal inquiry. The detectives observed a chilling pattern in Michelle Carter's communications that suggested her support had been a meticulously maintained facade. As they dug deeper into the data, they found that she hadn't just been a passive observer of Conrad's decline. She had been its primary accelerant. The investigators were struck by the clinical, almost administrative tone she adopted when discussing the logistics of his death. She had questioned him on why he hadn't yet secured the generator, and she had expressed a subtle, biting frustration whenever he hesitated. The digital record revealed that she had been testing the social impact of his death even before it occurred, telling friends he was missing or that she was heartbroken while he was still alive and texting her from his bedroom. However, the smoking gun didn't come from a message sent to Conrad. It came from a confession Michelle sent to a school friend, Samantha Boardman, 2 months after the funeral. In a series of frantic, guilt-ridden texts, Michelle admitted to her role in the Fairhaven parking lot. She told Samantha that she could have stopped him, and she confessed that when Conrad had stepped out of the truck because he was scared and the gas was working, she had commanded him to get back in. This admission transformed the case. It was no longer a question of whether she had encouraged him. It was a revelation that she had physically, albeit through a radio signal, intervened at the exact moment he had chosen life. When the Fairhaven Police and the Bristol County District Attorney's Office moved to indict the 17-year-old girl, they knew they were entering uncharted legal territory. The charge was involuntary manslaughter, but the challenge was unprecedented in Massachusetts law. There was no physical contact, no weapon, and no presence at the crime scene. The prosecution's theory rested on the idea that Michelle's words had become a coercive environment that overrode Conrad's free will. They argued that by telling him to return to the carbon monoxide, she had created a life-threatening situation and then failed to fulfill her duty to act. The community of Plainville was paralyzed by the news. The grieving widow, who had organized softball tournaments and sought the town's sympathy, was suddenly being portrayed as a digital executioner. Rumors began to circulate through the hallways of King Philip Regional High School, with peers questioning every interaction they'd had with her since the funeral. The fear in the local atmosphere was palpable. Parents began to look at their children's phones not as toys, but as potential instruments of homicide. The case challenged the very definition of presence in the 21st century, suggesting that a person could be a killer from 50 miles away. Michelle's defense team, led by Joseph Cataldo, prepared for a battle centered on the First Amendment and the limits of free speech. They argued that however distasteful her messages were, they were just words, not a crime. They suggested that Conrad had been the sole architect of his own death, and that Michelle was being scapegoated for a systemic failure of the mental health system. To bolster their case, they introduced a psychological defense of involuntary intoxication, claiming that the antidepressant Prozac, which Michelle had been prescribed, had logically uncoupled her from reality. They argued that the drug had caused her to become hyper-focused and delusional, leading her to believe that helping Conrad die was actually a compassionate act. The investigation also uncovered the unsettling depth of Michelle's obsession with tragedy as currency. Detectives found that she had spent hours researching the real-life grieving process of celebrities, almost as if she were studying for a role. They noted that she had sent messages to Conrad's mother that were nearly identical to scripts from the television show Glee, suggesting that her entire emotional reality was a performance constructed from pop culture tropes. This wasn't just a girl who was confused. This was a person who had commodified a human life to fill a void in her own social standing. As the trial date approached, the prosecution meticulously reconstructed the 43-minute phone call that occurred while Conrad was dying. Since the call wasn't recorded, they relied on Michelle's own text admissions to prove its content. They highlighted the paradox of her behavior. She had stayed on the line with him, listening to him gasp for air, yet she had told her friends she was on the phone with his mother, or couldn't get a hold of him. The level of deception was staggering. She was simultaneously acting as the Reaper on one line and the worried girlfriend on the other. The legal world watched with bated breath as the case moved toward a bench trial. The question was no longer just about Michelle Carter's guilt, but about whether the law could keep pace with technology. If a voice in a phone could kill, then the boundaries of personal responsibility had been permanently redrawn. The investigators had done their job. They had unlocked the phone and revealed the ghost in the machine. Now, it was up to the court to decide if those 60,000 blue bubbles carried the weight of a prison sentence, or if the digital world was still a place where you could say anything and walk away clean. The atmosphere in the courtroom during the pretrial hearings was one of cold, clinical tension. The Roy family sat on one side, a portrait of quiet, dignified devastation, while Michelle sat on the other. Her appearance drastically changed. Her hair lighter, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality. The detectives who had first scrolled through those messages testified about the sheer emotional exhaustion of the investigation. They described the feeling of reading a slow-motion car crash in reverse, knowing the ending but being forced to watch every deliberate step Michelle took to ensure Conrad didn't survive. The investigation had stripped away the all-American veneer of Plainville, leaving behind a gritty digital reality that no one was ready to face. The 2017 trial in Taunton, Massachusetts, eschewed the spectacle of a jury for a bench trial before Judge Lawrence Moniz, a strategic move that placed the weight of legal history on a single set of shoulders. The defense pivoted toward a controversial involuntary intoxication theory, suggesting that Michelle's medication had logically uncoupled her from reality, turning her into a girl lost in a pharmaceutical fog. They argued she truly believed she was performing a mercy killing. However, the prosecution dismantled this by presenting the cold, chronological precision of her correspondence, which revealed a girl in absolute command of her manipulative faculties. Judge Moniz's ruling was landmark. He clarified that he was not convicting her for the years of toxic messages, but for the specific moment she told Conrad to get back in and then chose to do nothing as he died. He ruled that her failure to act, combined with her lethal command, constituted wanton and reckless conduct. Michelle was sentenced to 15 months in jail, affirming a new legal truth. The screen was no longer a shield, and a voice could be a deadly weapon. Michelle Carter walked out of jail in early 2020, leaving behind a legal precedent that forever blurred the lines between speech and violence. But for the Roy family, there is no early release from the silence she helped create. Today, the push for legislation in his name continues, a flickering hope that no other child will ever be texted to death. In an age of infinite connectivity, we are reminded that the most dangerous weapon isn't always made of steel. Sometimes it is simply a glowing screen and a voice with the power to command the end. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. The flavor was off, slightly metallic, but the neighbors in Iron River, Michigan, didn't want to be rude. They chewed, swallowed, and complimented Kelly Cochran on her cooking, unaware they were digesting the remains of a missing Air Force veteran. It was 2014, and this wasn't an accident. It was the fulfillment of a murderous blood pact made on a wedding night years prior. As the sun set on that suburban backyard, the guests had no idea they were helping a serial killer destroy the evidence of her latest thrill. One man was dead, another was watching, and the nightmare was only beginning. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. The roots of this darkness didn't take hold in the cold soil of Michigan. They were planted years earlier in the industrial landscape of Merrillville, Indiana. Kelly Marie Moore and Jason Cochran were the quintessential high school sweethearts. At least, that was the image they projected to the world of the late 1990s. Kelly was a striking figure. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, she possessed a physical presence that was often described as imposing. She was intelligent, articulate, and possessed a magnetic, if somewhat unsettling, energy. Jason, by contrast, was smaller in stature and quieter in temperament, a man who seemed entirely defined by his devotion to the woman at his side. Their peers saw a couple that was inseparable, but the nature of that bond was far more restrictive than anyone could have guessed. They married in 2002, a union that was less about a romantic future and more about a dark, binding contract. It was on their wedding night that the couple reportedly entered into a pact that would eventually lead to the destruction of multiple lives. This wasn't a standard vow of, "until death do us part." It was a literal blood oath of mutual destruction. They agreed that if either of them ever strayed from the marriage, if an outsider ever threatened the integrity of their unit, that person would be eliminated. More chillingly, the spouse who committed the infidelity would be required to assist in the killing. It was a pact of blood designed to ensure that no one could ever come between them, a way to turn jealousy into a weapon of shared guilt. For over a decade, the Cochrans lived a relatively quiet, blue-collar life in Indiana. Kelly was the primary driver of the relationship, both socially and financially, while Jason's health began a slow, agonizing decline. A severe back injury from a work accident left him in chronic pain, eventually leading to a dependency on prescription opioids that clouded his judgment and heightened his insecurity. As Jason became more physically frail and reclusive, Kelly's dominance grew. She was the one who sought out excitement, the one who tested the boundaries of their social circles. Friends from their Indiana years later recalled that Kelly seemed to enjoy the power she held over Jason, often flirting with other men just to watch his reaction, to see the flash of territorial rage in his eyes that reminded her of their secret agreement. By 2013, the Cochrans decided they needed a fresh start. They packed their belongings and moved several hundred miles north to Iron River, a remote, rugged town in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It was a place where the winters were long and the forests were dense, the perfect backdrop for a couple looking to leave their past behind. They settled into a modest house on Casper Street, a quiet neighborhood where the residents looked out for one another. To the people of Iron River, the Cochrans were just another pair of newcomers trying to make it in a tough economy. Kelly quickly landed a job as a production worker at Oldberg, a local manufacturing plant, while Jason stayed home, hampered by his failing back and his growing list of medications. In Iron River, the power dynamic shifted even further. Kelly was now the sole breadwinner, spending her days on the factory floor and her evenings at local bars, soaking in the attention of a new community. She was known for her quick wit, her ability to outdrink most men, and a certain rough-around-the-edges charm that made her popular among her co-workers. Jason, meanwhile, sat in their darkened living room, his world shrinking to the four walls of their home, and the gnawing fear that his vibrant, imposing wife was slipping away from him. He was a man living in the shadow of a woman who was increasingly hungry for a reason to trigger their wedding night pact. She didn't just want an affair, she wanted a sacrifice. The atmosphere in the Cochran household during that first year in Michigan was described by those who visited as heavy, a thick layer of unspoken tension that seemed to vibrate between the husband and wife. Kelly would often recount stories of men at the plant who had taken an interest in her, recounting the details to Jason with a clinical detachment that seemed designed to provoke him. She was looking for a catalyst, a person who was friendly enough to fall into her trap, but significant enough to make the blood pact feel earned. In the late summer of 2014, She finally found that catalyst in a man named Christopher Regan. He was everything Jason wasn't: healthy, independent, and full of life. And Kelly knew exactly how to use him to bring her husband's darkest promises to fruition. Christopher Regan was a man who appreciated the quiet reliability of a well-earned life. A 53-year-old Air Force veteran who had seen the world and decided that the rugged, pine-scented landscape of Michigan's Upper Peninsula was where he wanted to plant his roots. He was known among his peers as a man of discipline and warmth, someone who could fix a complex machine as easily as he could strike up a conversation with a stranger in a diner. After a recent divorce, he had moved to Iron River to take a job as a production manager at the Oldenburg manufacturing facility, a place that hummed with the heavy, rhythmic thrum of production for naval ship parts. For Chris, the job was a stable anchor, a way to bridge the gap between his military past and a peaceful retirement. He spent his free time hiking the trails of Iron County, capturing the stark beauty of the woods through his camera lens, not realizing that the most dangerous predator in those forests was already punching the same time clock as him. The factory floor at Oldenburg was a world of steel, grease, and the constant metallic tang of industrial work. It was in this environment that Chris first met Kelly Cochran. At 34, Kelly was nearly 20 years his junior, yet she possessed a commanding, almost aggressive presence that stood out among the other workers. She was vocal, physically imposing, and had a way of looking at people that felt less like an introduction and more like a tactical assessment. To Chris, she was a welcome spark of energy in the repetitive grind of the factory floor. They began as friendly co-workers, sharing coffee and conversation in the break room, but Kelly had a talent for accelerating intimacy, for making a man feel like the sole focus of her world. The affair began in the late summer of 2014, a season where the air in the Upper Peninsula begins to turn crisp and the leaves start their slow transition into shades of amber and rust. Kelly didn't just enter Chris's life, she occupied it. She painted a picture of herself as a woman trapped in a stagnant, unhappy marriage to a man who was physically and emotionally fading. She told Chris that Jason was aware of her extracurricular interests and that he simply didn't care, a lie designed to lower Chris's defenses and make the relationship feel safe. For a man like Chris, who valued honesty and directness, the idea of a mutually understood, open marriage was easier to digest than the reality of a jealous husband waiting in the shadows. Behind the closed doors of the Cochran house on Casper Street, the atmosphere was far more volatile than Kelly let on. Jason was a man in a state of slow collapse, hampered by chronic back pain, struggling with depression, and increasingly reliant on the medications that Kelly often controlled. He was a worrier by nature, a man who felt his grip on his vibrant wife slipping away with every hour she spent away from the home. Kelly didn't soothe his insecurities, she weaponized them. She would return home and recount her interactions with Chris, describing the veteran's kindness and vitality in a way that felt like a direct insult to Jason's own frailty. She was pushing her husband toward the edge, reminding him of the wedding night pact they had made years earlier, the promise that any outsider who threatened their bond would be eliminated. The psychological games Kelly played weren't limited to the two men at the center of the triangle. She was also reportedly engaging with another coworker, Eric Erickson, around the same time. It was as if she were gathering options for a sacrifice, scouting for the perfect candidate to test the strength of Jason's devotion and the lethality of their shared oath. Chris Regan, with his predictable routines and his genuine affection for Kelly, was the easiest target to track. He was a man who followed his heart, even when it led him into the tangled web of a woman who viewed relationships as a form of combat. As the weeks progressed, Chris began to realize that the relationship with Kelly wasn't going to be the long-term partnership he had perhaps hoped for. He was a man of substance, looking for a genuine connection, while Kelly was increasingly erratic and demanding. He began to pull back, focusing more on his upcoming plans to move to Asheville, North Carolina, for a fresh job opportunity. He was gassing up his car, packing his apartment, and looking toward a future that didn't include the heavy, suffocating drama of the Cochran household. To Chris, the affair was a seasonal distraction that had run its course. But to Kelly, his desire to leave was a personal affront that could only be answered with the terms of the pact. She began to coordinate the final movement of the trap. She whispered to Jason that Chris was the one who was pushing the boundaries, that he was the threat they had discussed on their wedding night. She convinced her husband that the only way to save their marriage, to prove that they were still the unit they had sworn to be, was to follow through on their promise. Jason, desperate to reclaim his status and appease the woman he worshipped, agreed to the impossible. The plan was not just to kill, but to participate together, to bond their souls through a shared, horrific secret that would ensure neither could ever leave the other. In the days leading up to October 14th, 2014, Kelly maintained a mask of absolute normalcy. She continued to flirt with Chris, discussing his move, and even helping him with the logistics of his departure. She was the one who suggested a final lasagna and sex encounter at her home, a classic, manipulative goodbye that Chris had no reason to refuse. He saw it as a kind gesture, a final pleasant memory before he drove south, unaware that the instructions for the meal and the encounter were being discussed in the basement below. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of Jason's heavy tobacco and the underlying sterile smell of the medications he took to manage his pain. Jason himself was out of sight, tucked away in the shadows of the small home, waiting for the signal. Kelly led Chris toward the door, her voice light as she welcomed him for what he thought was their final night together. She moved with a practiced ease, her large frame blocking the light from the hallway, casting long, jagged shadows across the wooden floor. Chris followed, his mind likely on his journey the next morning, thinking about the boxes he still had to tape shut. He entered the Cochran residence on that Tuesday evening with the relaxed confidence of a man meeting a friend, not realizing that the basement floor was already being prepped for the aftermath of his arrival. The irony of Chris's life was that his military background, which had taught him to identify threats on a battlefield, had not prepared him for the domestic warfare of a sociopathic marriage. He stepped into the small, nondescript house, the smell of autumn wood smoke in the air, and moved toward the woman he believed was his lover, unaware that her husband was already positioned with a rifle, waiting for the signal to honor a blood pact that had been waiting for a victim for 12 years. Tuesday, October 14th, 2014, began as a day of transition for Christopher Reagan, a man with his eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. His bags were largely packed, his vehicle was prepped for the long haul to North Carolina, and his departure from the rugged chill of Iron River was only hours away. He viewed his final visit to the Cochran residence as a graceful exit, a chance to share a final meal and say a quiet goodbye to a woman who had been a significant, if complicated, part of his recent past. He pulled his vehicle into the driveway on Casper Street as the autumn twilight began to deepen, the air turning sharp with the promise of an early frost. He stepped out of the car, likely feeling the weight of the move ahead of him, and walked toward the front door of the modest home, unaware that the interior had been meticulously staged for his arrival. Inside, the atmosphere was a calculated mask of domestic warmth. Kelly had prepared a lasagna, the very meal she had used as a lure, and the scent of garlic and baked pasta filled the small house, creating a sensory trap that signaled safety and intimacy. But beneath the aroma of the meal was the stale, sterile scent of the medications Jason used to numb his chronic pain. Jason himself was invisible, a ghost in his own home, tucked away in a prearranged position in the shadows. He was a man fueled by a toxic cocktail of physical agony, opioid-induced haze, and a desperate need to reclaim his standing in Kelly's eyes. He gripped a .22 caliber rifle, a weapon chosen for its relatively quiet report and its clinical efficiency at close range. The weapon was an extension of the blood pact they had sworn over a decade ago, a physical manifestation of a promise that was about to be kept. The ruse began shortly after the meal. Kelly initiated a practiced sequence of events designed to move Chris into the kill zone. She directed his attention toward a light fixture in the basement or a nearby workspace, claiming that it was malfunctioning and needed a veteran's eye to fix. It was a request that played perfectly into Chris's nature. A man who was always willing to help, always ready to apply his mechanical skills to a problem. As he turned his back to the room to inspect the fixture, he was no longer a lover or a friend. He was a target. The transition from life to evidence was instantaneous. From the shadows, Jason stepped forward with the rifle. There was no dramatic confrontation, no exchange of words. Only the sharp metallic snap of the firing pin and the muffled pop of the .22 round. The bullet struck Chris in the back of the head, a cowardly and clinical execution that sent him to the floor before he could even register the betrayal. In that moment, the blood pact was no longer a theoretical oath. It was a shared reality. The silence that followed the shot was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythmic ticking of a clock. What followed was a descent into a level of depravity that most people cannot comprehend. The Cochrans didn't panic. They went to work. They moved Chris's body to the basement, a space they had already prepared with plastic sheeting and the tools of their grisly trade. The primary instrument of their shared work was a reciprocating saw, a sawzall. Kelly would later describe the process to investigators with a chilling, detached precision, explaining how they worked together to process the man who had been her lover. The sound of the saw would have been a jagged, mechanical scream echoing through the floorboards of the quiet Casper Street neighborhood. The vibration would have been felt in their own hands as they moved the blade through bone and tissue, a rhythmic, industrial labor that lasted for hours. Kelly was reportedly the one who directed the process, showing no signs of the emotional or physical revulsion that would paralyze a normal person. She viewed the task as a logistical necessity, a way to honor the pact and ensure their mutual survival. They worked through the night, the basement lights casting long, distorted shadows as they reduced a human being into a series of manageable packages. The remains were placed into heavy-duty plastic bags, which were then stored in a freezer in the garage. But the most horrific aspect of the cleanup wasn't just the disposal of the body. It was the psychological game Kelly played with the community. In the days following the murder, the Cochrans didn't retreat into isolation. Instead, they hosted a neighborhood barbecue. Neighbors later recalled a gathering where Kelly was the life of the party, laughing and serving meat that she claimed was special, something she had processed herself. Several guests noted that the meat had a strange, slightly metallic flavor that they couldn't quite place, but they ate it anyway, unwilling to offend their hosts. The realization of what they might have consumed would later haunt the residents of Iron River for years. To Kelly, serving Chris's remains to her neighbors wasn't just a way to dispose of evidence. It was an ultimate act of dominance and mockery. She was forcing the community to participate in her crime, turning a mundane social ritual into a cannibalistic secret that only she and Jason truly understood. The cleaning of the house was just as meticulous. They used gallons of bleach and industrial cleaners to scrub the basement floor, targeting every crevice and crack where biological evidence might linger. They burned Chris's clothing and personal effects in a backyard fire pit, the smoke drifting up into the Michigan sky, carrying away the last remnants of his identity. By the time the sun rose on the morning after the lasagna dinner, the Cochran house looked exactly as it always had, a quiet, nondescript home in a blue-collar town. The only difference was the contents of the freezer in the garage and the new, jagged bond between the husband and wife. A bond forged in the blood of a man who had made the mistake of believing in Kelly Cochran's humanity. The silence that followed the departure of Christopher Regan from the world was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping realization that began with a missing presence at a morning meeting. On October 17th, 2014, Chris was expected to begin his new life in Asheville, North Carolina, a 1,000-mile journey from the iron-rich soil of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. When he failed to show up for his first day at the new job, the professional concern quickly curdled into a personal dread among his family and friends. Chris was a man of his word, an Air Force veteran whose life was governed by schedules and reliability. His absence was a loud, discordant note in the quiet rhythm of Iron River. The first physical evidence of his disappearance was found 10 days later, on October 27th. His vehicle, an Oldsmobile, was discovered in a park-and-ride lot off US 2, just outside of town. The car sat like a tomb, its windows frosted by the early Michigan winter, untouched and abandoned. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. Just the heavy, oppressive weight of a man who had simply stepped out of his life and vanished into the tree line. The discovery turned a missing persons case into a criminal investigation and the focus of the Iron River Police Department, led by Chief Laura Frizzo, turned toward the people who had seen him last. Chief Frizzo was a tenacious investigator, a woman who knew the terrain and the people of Iron County. When the name Kelly Cochran surfaced as a frequent contact in Chris's phone records, the detectives made their way to the house on Casper Street. The first meeting with Kelly was a study in unsettling behavior. Rather than the expected somberness of a woman whose friend had disappeared, Kelly was light, engaging, and strangely flirtatious. She told the investigators that she and Chris had been involved in a casual affair, one that her husband Jason was not only aware of, but supposedly encouraged. She leaned against the doorframe, her large frame casting a shadow over the porch, and spoke about Chris with a detached fondness that felt rehearsed. Jason's presence during these early interviews was even more jarring. He sat in the background, a frail, nervous figure who seemed to be constantly checking with Kelly before he spoke. When he did offer information, his voice was thin and strained. He told the detectives that he had no ill will toward Chris and that he only wanted to see the man found safely, but his eyes told a different story. They were darting, restless, and filled with a visible terror that the investigators couldn't quite place. He seemed like a man who was vibrating with a secret he wasn't strong enough to hold, yet he remained tethered to his wife's side like a frightened child. The community of Iron River was soon swept up in the search efforts. Volunteers combed the dense forests and the jagged banks of the Iron River, their breath visible in the freezing air. They looked for disturbed earth, for discarded clothing, for anything that might lead them to the veteran. Meanwhile, Kelly Cochran was doing something entirely different. She began a strange psychological game with Chief Frizzo, calling the police station frequently and showing up unannounced to check on the progress of the case. She tried to insert herself into the investigation, acting as if she and the chief were peers, two strong women navigating a man's world. It was a classic hider-in-plain-sight tactic, the arrogance of a killer who believes they are smarter than the law. Behind the scenes, the Cochrans were liquidating their lives. Shortly after the car was found, they put their house on the market and began making plans to move back to Indiana. They told their neighbors that the drama of the investigation was too much for Jason's health to handle. To the police, this looked like a tactical retreat. A search warrant was eventually executed on the Casper Street home, but the results were frustratingly thin. The basement had been scrubbed with a level of intensity that bordered on the clinical. The floorboards were spotless, and the scent of bleach was so strong it made the officers' eyes water. They found small traces of what they suspected was blood, but without a body or a confession, the evidence was circumstantial at best. The frustration in the police department was palpable. They knew the Cochrans were involved, but Kelly's mask remained perfectly intact. She continued to play the role of the misunderstood woman, even as rumors began to swirl through the town about that neighborhood barbecue. People started talking about the sweet-tasting meat, and Kelly's odd comments about processing things herself. The gossip was a dark, persistent hum underneath the official investigation, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that made Iron River feel smaller and more claustrophobic with each passing day. As the weeks turned into months, the search for Chris Regan stalled. The winter snows buried the landscape, hiding any potential evidence under feet of white silence. Chris's family was left in a state of agonizing limbo, caught between the hope of his return and the growing certainty that he had met a violent end. Kelly and Jason eventually left Michigan, slipping away to Merrillville, Indiana, believing they had outrun the shadow of the Casper Street basement. They thought the blood pact had protected them, that by sharing the weight of the saw and the bleach, they had become untouchable. But Chief Frizzo wasn't letting go. She kept the case file on her desk, a constant reminder of the veteran who hadn't made it to North Carolina. She continued to monitor the Cochrans from a distance, waiting for the inevitable crack in the foundation of their toxic union. She knew that a bond built on blood and sawzalls couldn't last forever, and that eventually the weight of the secret would become too heavy even for a woman like Kelly to carry. The search wasn't over. It had simply moved from the woods of Michigan to the psychological battlefield of Indiana, where the next victim of the wedding night pact was already living on borrowed time. The investigation into the disappearance of Christopher Regan didn't die when the snow fell over Iron River. It simply went underground, following the Cochrans as they retreated back to the industrial familiarity of Merrillville, Indiana. For over a year, a strange, silent stalemate existed between the Michigan authorities and the couple. Chief Laura Frizzo remained convinced that the answer to Chris's fate lay within the heavy, bleach-scented basement of the house on Casper Street. But without a body or a witness, the law was paralyzed. That changed on February 20th, 2016, when a frantic 911 call originated from the Cochrans' new residence. Jason Cochran was dead. To the responding officers in Indiana, it looked like a tragic, if somewhat expected, conclusion to a life lived in the grip of chronic pain. Jason was found unresponsive, and Kelly, playing the role of the devastated widow to perfection, claimed that her husband had finally succumbed to his health struggles and a potential overdose of his prescribed medications. Initially, the scene was processed as a medical emergency, followed by a natural death. But the timing was too convenient for the investigators in Michigan. Jason was the weak link in the blood pact, the man whose eyes darted with terror every time a badge appeared on his porch. With him gone, the only other person who knew what happened in that Michigan basement was Kelly. The pivot in the case came when the Lake County Medical Examiner's Office conducted the autopsy. While Jason did have a high level of heroin in his system, the forensic pathologist discovered something that shattered Kelly's accidental overdose narrative. There were subtle but undeniable signs of asphyxiation, petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, and bruising that suggested someone had forcibly held a pillow or a hand over Jason's face until his heart stopped. The heroin hadn't killed him. It had merely neutralized him, making him a passive participant in his own murder. Kelly hadn't just lost a husband, she had liquidated an asset that had become a liability. As the Indiana authorities moved to classify the death as a homicide, Kelly sensed the shift in the atmosphere. She didn't wait for the handcuffs. She packed a bag and fled, launching a multi-state manhunt that eventually ended in Kentucky. When the United States Marshals finally closed in, Kelly didn't go down fighting. She surrendered with a chilling calm, almost as if she had been waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of her performance. She was extradited back to the Midwest, and the interrogation that followed would become a landmark in the study of the sociopathic mind. The interrogation room was a stark contrast to the domestic stages Kelly was used to. Under the hum of the fluorescent lights, the mask of sanity began to slip, not because Kelly was breaking, but because she was bored. She began a series of high-stakes interviews with investigators, including a particularly intense session with Detective Jeremy Ogden. Kelly didn't just confess, she negotiated. She spoke about the night of October 14th, 2014, with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing a routine procedure. She admitted to the killing of Christopher Reagan, but in her version of the story, she was a victim of Jason's jealousy. She claimed that Jason had caught them together and forced her to watch the execution, then compelled her to help dismember the body to ensure her silence. It was during these sessions that the full, nauseating scope of the blood pact was revealed. Kelly described the wedding night oath in detail, the agreement that any interloper would be sacrificed. But as the detectives pushed further, the most horrific detail of the Iron River investigation resurfaced: the neighborhood barbecue. Kelly admitted that she had processed Chris's remains and served them to the unsuspecting residents of Casper Street. She spoke about the sweetness of the meat and the irony of her neighbors praising her cooking while they consumed the man they had seen walking his dog just days before. It was an admission that sent a shockwave through the Iron River community, turning a local tragedy into a permanent psychological scar for everyone who had attended that gathering. The investigation then turned to the physical recovery of the evidence Kelly had described. In a scene that felt ripped from a gothic horror novel, Kelly led investigators into the dense, mosquito-ridden woods of the Upper Peninsula. She walked through the brush with an uncanny sense of direction, eventually pointing to a specific patch of earth near a cluster of pines. There, beneath the layers of pine needles and dirt, forensics teams discovered the upper portion of a human skull. It bore a single, clean entry wound from a .22 caliber round. Christopher Reagan had finally been found. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation was that of a woman who viewed other people as objects to be manipulated or consumed, quite literally. Kelly admitted that she had killed Jason not out of fear, but as a form of evening the score. She felt that by killing Chris, Jason had taken away something she valued, and therefore his life was the only acceptable currency to balance the books. She had injected him with a lethal dose of heroin and then sat on his chest, covering his face while he struggled weakly beneath her, watching the life leave his eyes with the same curiosity she might have shown toward a broken machine. The investigation also touched on Kelly's claim that she was responsible for several other murders across multiple states, a claim of being a prolific serial killer. While many of these leads were difficult to verify due to her habit of weaving truth with elaborate lies, the sheer coldness of her demeanor made it impossible for the FBI to ignore. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with a woman who had been pushed too far by a toxic marriage. They were dealing with a predator who had found a partner willing to facilitate her darkest impulses and who had eventually outgrown him. By the time the case headed to trial, the investigation had painted a portrait of a marriage that wasn't a partnership. It was a joint venture in homicide, and Kelly Cochran was the CEO. The legal reckoning for Kelly Cochran began in an Iron County courtroom in early 2017. Prosecutors laid out a narrative of a wedding night pact that had transitioned from a dark fantasy into a mechanical reality, painting Kelly as the true architect of the violence. The jury didn't take long to see past her shifting stories and claims of victimhood. In May 2017, she was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and several other charges related to the death of Chris Reagan. The judge didn't hold back, sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the justice system wasn't finished. A year later, in an Indiana court, Kelly pleaded guilty to the murder of her husband, Jason. She admitted to the overdose and smothering method with a terrifying lack of emotion, receiving an additional 65-year sentence. As she was led away in shackles, her only concern seemed to be the spotlight, leaving behind two grieving families and a neighborhood forever haunted by a meal they can never forget. Today, the house on Casper Street stands as a silent, crumbling monument to a betrayal that defies human logic. Kelly Cochran remains behind bars, periodically teasing investigators with cryptic hints of 7 other victims buried across the Midwest, a cruel claim that keeps the families of the missing in a state of perpetual unrest. She is a woman who chose a dark blood pact over her own humanity, proving that some wedding vows are better left unmade. The former neighbors in Iron River still look at their backyard grills with a cold shudder, forever remembering the smiling woman who turned a quiet community into her unwitting accomplices. Christopher Reagan is finally home, but the darkness Kelly invited into that Michigan basement remains. Cold, hungry, and entirely unrepentant. Her story serves as a jagged reminder that the most terrifying predators aren't found in the woods, but in the people we choose to trust. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. August 30th, 2023, Ivins, Utah. A single, desperate knock on a neighbor's door ends a nightmare. A 12-year-old boy stands on the porch, emaciated, his skin clinging to bone. Around his ankles and wrists, the weeping sores and sticky residue of silver duct tape reveal the reality of a literal prison. He doesn't ask for a phone or a parent. He begs only for a crumb of bread and a sip of water. This is the moment the digital empire of the world's most famous parenting expert collapsed. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. The sprawling, sun-drenched valleys of Springville, Utah, provide a picturesque backdrop for what many believed was the ultimate American success story. A narrative built on the foundation of faith, family, and the relentless pursuit of moral perfection. Long before the police tape and the harrowing headlines, Ruby Franco was the architect of a digital dynasty that redefined the mommy vlogging genre for a global audience of millions. Born into a culture that elevates motherhood to a divine calling, Ruby did not just raise her children, she broadcasted them. In early 2015, she and her husband, Kevin, launched 8 Passengers, a YouTube channel that documented the daily lives of a family of 8. The premise was simple, wholesome, and addictive. 6 beautiful children, a devoted father, and a mother who possessed an almost terrifyingly clear vision of how a household should be run. To the casual observer scrolling through their feed, the Franca home was a temple of order. The kitchens were always gleaming, the children were impeccably dressed in coordinated outfits, and every conflict was resolved with a firm, moralizing lesson. Ruby was the face of this enterprise, a woman with sharp features and a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. She presented herself not just as a parent, but as a sentinel of traditional values in a world she believed was slipping into chaos. For years, the channel grew at an astronomical rate, eventually amassing over 2.5 million subscribers who tuned in to watch everything from holiday preparations to the mundane details of homeschooling. The 8 Passengers aesthetic was carefully curated, a sea of beige palettes, white linens, and the specific vernacular of blessings and stewardship that resonated deeply within the Mormon community and beyond. But as the subscriber count climbed, the 8 Passengers brand began to shift. The focus moved away from the joy of family life and toward a rigid, uncompromising brand of discipline that started to set off alarm bells in the darker corners of the internet. Ruby's parenting style was not just strict, it was performative. She often told her audience that her primary duty was to prepare her children's souls for eternity, even if that meant denying them the basic comforts that most would consider fundamental human rights. The digital record of this era is a slow-motion car crash of escalating lessons. In one notorious video, Ruby recounted how her oldest son, Chad, had been stripped of his bed for 7 months as punishment for a behavioral infraction, forced to sleep on a beanbag chair in a common area. In another, she explained with chilling calm that she would not bring a lunch to her young daughter, Eve, who had forgotten it at home, stating that the pain of hunger was a necessary teacher and that the school staff should not intervene. This was the 8 Passengers doctrine. Love was conditional, and suffering was a tool for spiritual growth. Ruby's husband, Kevin, a professor at Brigham Young University, often stood by her side, a quiet enforcer who validated her increasingly draconian methods. Together, they built a fortress around their family, one constructed from high-definition cameras and a theology of absolute control. The fans who had once praised Ruby for her refreshing honesty began to notice a change in the children's eyes, a lack of spark, a visible tension whenever their mother entered the frame. By 2020, the concern had reached a fever pitch. A Change.org petition began circulating, calling for Child Protective Services to investigate the Franca household after videos surfaced of Ruby threatening to chop off a child's doll's head or withholding food as punishment for a child losing their privilege to eat. The authorities did visit the home in 2020, but the investigation was closed without significant action. Ruby used this as a badge of honor, telling her viewers that the haters were simply people who lived in distortion and didn't understand the truth. She became more isolated, more defensive, and more convinced of her own righteousness. The digital dynasty was no longer just a business, it was a crusade. As the COVID-19 pandemic forced the world into isolation, the Franca home became a black box. The public vlogging slowed down, and Ruby began looking for something even more extreme, a philosophy that would justify the growing darkness within her home. She was a woman who had spent a decade convincing the world she was the perfect mother, all while the foundations of her family were being systematically dismantled by her own hands. She was merely preparing for the arrival of a partner who would turn her strict discipline into a lethal, state-sanctioned ideology of abuse. As the sun began to set on the 8 passengers era, a new, more clinical shadow stretched across the Franca household, a shadow that arrived in the form of a woman named Jodi Hildebrandt. To the outside world, Jodi was a licensed therapist and the founder of a mental health curriculum called Connections Classroom. She marketed herself as an expert in addiction and relationship counseling, but behind the professional veneer lay a history of controversy and a philosophy that leaned toward the cultish. For Ruby, who was reeling from the public backlash of 2020 and looking for a way to legitimize her increasingly harsh parenting, Jodi wasn't just a consultant, she was a messiah. The partnership began as a business collaboration, but quickly mutated into a total psychological takeover. Jodi's Connections philosophy was built on a brutal binary. There was truth, and there was distortion. According to Jodi, anyone who did not adhere to her specific, rigid moral code was living in distortion, a state she characterized as being influenced by darkness or even demonic forces. For Ruby, this was the ultimate validation. The fans who criticized her weren't concerned citizens. They were people in distortion. The children who rebelled against her rules weren't just being kids, they were choosing darkness. By 2021, the wholesome, beige-toned vlogs of the Franca family had been replaced by the stark, sterile videos of Moms of Truth, a Facebook group and YouTube channel where Ruby and Jodi sat side by side, delivering lectures on spiritual warfare to a captive audience of parents. The shift in Ruby's demeanor was striking. The mother who had once smiled for the camera now looked at the lens with a cold, unblinking intensity. She spoke with a flat affect, her language stripped of warmth and replaced with clinical, judgmental terminology. Together, she and Jodi began to systematically dismantle the Franca family from the inside out. The first to be purged were the extended family members, Ruby's parents and her siblings, many of whom were successful influencers in their own right, were publicly labeled as unsafe and toxic because they didn't subscribe to the Connections doctrine. Ruby told her followers that she was cutting off the rot to save her children's souls, effectively isolating her 6 children from every support system they had ever known. But the most significant casualty of the Connections era was Ruby's husband, Kevin. For years, Kevin had been the silent partner in the 8 passengers empire, but under Jodi's influence, he was reimagined as a threat to the family's spiritual purity. Jodi convinced Ruby that Kevin was in distortion, and in a move that shocked those who still followed the family, Kevin was pressured to move out of the family home. He was placed on a rehabilitation program designed by Jodi, forbidden from contacting his children or his wife until he had cleansed himself of his perceived spiritual failings. The man who had helped build the digital dynasty was now an outcast, left to watch from the sidelines as his wife and children vanished into the desert of southern Utah. With Kevin gone and the extended family silenced, Jodi Hildebrandt became the de facto head of the household. The family moved their operations to Ivins, Utah, a remote and rugged landscape dominated by red rock cliffs and intense desert heat. Here, in Jody's sprawling fortress-like residence, the Konieczyn's philosophy moved from theory to practice. The Moms of Truth lectures became increasingly extremist. Ruby and Jody began telling their audience that children were not born with inherent worth, but had to earn it through absolute obedience. They claimed that physical discomfort was the only way to wake up a soul trapped in distortion. The financial structure of this partnership was equally predatory. Konieczyn's wasn't just a philosophy, it was a high-priced subscription service. Parents paid thousands of dollars for consultations and access to truth workshops, where they were taught to treat their children with the same cold, calculated detachment that Ruby was now practicing. In the echo chamber of their digital community, Ruby and Jody were untouchable. They had created a world where empathy was a weakness and cruelty was a divine necessity. Inside the Ivins home, the cameras that had once broadcasted every meal and holiday were finally turned off. The digital record ended and a period of absolute, terrifying silence began. The children were no longer passengers in a family vlog. They were prisoners in a spiritual penitentiary. Ruby had fully transitioned from a mother who overshared to a woman who guarded her secrets with a lethal intensity. She had surrendered her identity, her marriage, and her children to Jody Hildebrandt, convinced that by inflicting pain on those she loved, she was performing the highest form of service to God. The stage was set for the final, brutal descent, a descent that would take place far from the eyes of the millions of subscribers who had once called Ruby Frank an inspiration. The atmosphere in Ivins was one of heavy, paranoid isolation. The red dust of the desert seemed to coat everything, a physical manifestation of the grit and harshness that had taken over Ruby's soul. Neighbors in the quiet cul-de-sac noticed the lack of activity. The blinds were always drawn, and the children, who should have been playing in the yard or attending school, were never seen. Behind those drawn blinds, the Konieczyn's curriculum was being applied with a savagery that no one on the outside could have imagined. Ruby had become an apprentice to Jody's peculiar brand of evil, learning that a child's will had to be broken before their spirit could be saved. Every action, every word, and every thought of the children was scrutinized for signs of distortion. In this environment, the very concept of home was erased, replaced by a battlefield where a mother saw her own flesh and blood as enemies of the truth. The digital 8 passengers brand was dead, but the horror it left in its wake was only just beginning to take its final physical form. The transition from the manicured suburbs of Springville to the jagged, sun-bleached horizon of Ivins was more than a change of scenery. It was a deliberate descent into an alternate reality where the laws of the state and the basic instincts of motherhood ceased to exist. In the summer of 2023, as the mercury in southern Utah routinely climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the residence of Jody Hildebrandt became a site of systematic extraction. In the twisted lexicon of Konieczyn's, the children were no longer innocent victims of circumstance. They were vessels of distortion that required extreme physical intervention to be saved. Ruby Franca, once a woman who obsessed over the lighting and composition of her family vlogs, now applied that same meticulous focus to the administration of pain. The house was not a home, it was a laboratory of suffering. While the rest of the world moved through the mundane rhythms of summer, Ruby's 12-year-old son and 9-year-old daughter were subjected to a regimen of penance that sounds like something pulled from a medieval inquisitor's manual. The 12-year-old, a boy who had once been the star of high-energy YouTube challenges, was now a ghost in his own skin. Under the direct supervision of his mother and Jody, he was forced into grueling manual labor in the relentless desert sun. Hours spent hauling heavy stones, digging in the parched earth, and standing for days on end as a form of meditation. He was frequently forced to wear heavy, thick winter boots while working in the blistering heat, a detail designed specifically to maximize his physical discomfort. When the labor wasn't enough to break the darkness, the punishments became more direct and more clinical. Ruby's own journals, later recovered by investigators, detailed these moments with a chilling, detached sense of pride. She described how she would withhold food and water for days at a time, viewing the boy's resulting weakness not as malnutrition, but as a sign that his evil spirit was being starved out. When the boy attempted to sneak water or food, the response was a swift escalation of violence. He was told repeatedly that he was possessed, that he was a liar, that he was a snake who did not deserve the air he breathed. The physical restraints were the most harrowing evolution of the Connexion's curriculum. For weeks leading up to the end of August, the 12-year-old was kept in a state of near constant bondage. Initially, ropes were used to tie his hands and feet together, but when he struggled against them, Ruby and Jody switched to silver duct tape. They wrapped the tape around his wrists and ankles so tightly that it cut into his circulation, creating deep, weeping sores that would never have the chance to heal. In a display of calculated cruelty that defies the imagination, they reportedly applied cayenne pepper and honey to these open wounds, an herbal remedy that was actually a form of chemical torture designed to ensure that every movement the boy made was accompanied by an agonizing sting. The psychological warfare was just as devastating as the physical. The children were isolated from one another, kept in separate areas of the house to prevent them from offering each other even a shred of comfort. The 9-year-old daughter was subjected to her own version of the nightmare, forced to run barefoot on dirt roads until her feet were blistered and bloody, then made to stand in the sun as a lesson in obedience. She was told that her mother's love was a privilege she had forfeited through her sinful nature. This was the truth that Ruby and Jody preached, a world where a mother's primary duty was to be an executioner of her child's will. The environment inside the Ivins' house was one of absolute suffocating silence. There were no toys, no books, no screens, nothing but the stark white walls and the sound of Jody and Ruby's voices reciting the tenets of their extremist ideology. The children were taught that the outside world was a place of distortion and that the authorities, their father, and their grandparents were all agents of darkness. They were trapped in a feedback loop of trauma, where the only way to escape the pain was to admit to sins they hadn't committed and to embrace a version of reality that painted them as monsters. Ruby Frank's descent was total. She was no longer a bystander to Jody's madness. She was an active, enthusiastic participant. In her writings, she marveled at the clarity that came through the children's suffering. She described the boy's emaciated frame and his bound limbs as beautiful, seeing them as physical manifestations of a soul being cleansed. She had successfully commodified her children's lives for years on YouTube, and now she was commodifying their pain for her own spiritual gratification. As July turned into August, the boy's condition became critical. He had lost a significant percentage of his body weight, his ribs protruding like the hull of a wrecked ship. His wounds were infected, and his mind was beginning to fracture under the weight of the constant sensory deprivation and physical abuse. He knew that he was dying. He could feel the life slipping away in the quiet hours of the night when he was left bound and alone on the floor of the laundry room. It was in this state of terminal desperation that a spark of his old self, the boy who loved speed, the boy who once laughed in front of a camera, flickered back to life. He realized that no one was coming to save him. He was in a fortress guarded by the woman who was supposed to protect him most. The hidden penitentiary of Ivins was a place where the concept of time had dissolved into a blur of heat and agony. But even in the darkness of the Connexion's era, the human will to survive is a difficult thing to fully extinguish. While Ruby and Jody sat in the living room, perhaps planning their next lecture on the truth, the 12-year-old began to study the window of the room where he was kept. He began to calculate the distance to the nearest house. He began to weigh the risk of a final desperate run against the certainty of death inside those walls. The descent was over. The bottom had been reached, and the only thing left was the escape. The heat of the Utah desert continued to shimmer off the red rocks outside, oblivious to the horror unfolding within the stucco walls of the Hildebrandt residence. Inside, the boy waited for a moment of lapse in his mother's vigilance. A moment when the 8 passengers matriarch was distracted by her own delusions. He was 60 pounds of skin and bone, his limbs scarred by tape, and his spirit weathered by months of psychological warfare. But he was ready to risk everything for a single sip of water and the chance to tell the world what had happened in the shadows of the perfect mother's empire. The morning of August 30th, 2023, arrived with the same suffocating heat that had defined the children's summer of penance. Inside the walls of the Hildebrandt fortress, the air was thick with the sterile scent of cleaning supplies and the heavy, stagnant silence of a house where children were trained to be invisible. But in a small room near the back of the residence, a 12-year-old boy was performing a feat of physical and psychological endurance that would soon shatter the digital facade of his mother's empire. He had reached the threshold of death, and in that terminal clarity, the fear of his mother's truth was finally eclipsed by the primal urge to breathe another day. He moved with a ghostly quiet, his emaciated frame, barely 60 pounds, slipping toward the window. Every movement was a symphony of agony. The silver duct tape around his wrists and ankles had become a part of his anatomy, the adhesive bonding with the raw, weeping flesh of his infections. He didn't just climb out of the window, he spilled out of it, his frail limbs hitting the parched Utah soil with a dull thud. For a moment, he lay there, the red dust of Ivan's coating his scarred skin, listening for the sound of a door opening or the sharp clinical call of Ruby's voice. But there was only the wind. The journey across the manicured lawns of the cul-de-sac was a walk through a gauntlet of terror. To the boy, every open space was a trap. Every shadow was a potential hiding place for the women who had spent months convincing him he was a vessel of darkness. He reached a neighbor's house, his legs trembling under the weight of his own skeletal body. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply knocked. When the door opened, the neighbor was not greeted by a typical neighborhood child, but by a vision of absolute horror. A boy who looked as though he had been plucked from a historical archive of a famine, his ribs visible through his translucent skin, his limbs bound by the industrial remnants of his mother's discipline. The neighbor later recounted to the authorities how the boy's first requests were not for his parents or for safety, but for the basic elements of survival. He asked for a sip of water and a piece of bread, his voice steady but hollow. The sight of the duct tape around the boy's extremities and the deep, purulent wounds beneath prompted an immediate call to 911. The neighbor's voice on the recorded line was thick with a mixture of disbelief and frantic urgency as he described the child on his porch, noting that the boy appeared to be covered in sores and was clearly malnourished. While waiting for the sirens, the boy sat quietly, consuming the offered food with a focused intensity, his eyes scanning the horizon for the mother he knew would be coming for him. When the first responders arrived, the atmosphere in the quiet neighborhood shifted from suburban peace to a high-stakes crime scene. The paramedics were visually shaken by the boy's condition. He was so severely dehydrated and starved that his vital signs were erratic, his body on the verge of multiple organ failure. They noted the honey and cayenne residue on his wounds, the natural remedy Ruby had documented in her journals, which served only to irritate the deep lacerations caused by his restraints. As he was loaded into the ambulance, the boy provided the address of the Hildebrandt residence, and the focus of the police turned toward the stucco house that sat like a silent sentinel at the end of the road. The raid on the house was not a cinematic explosion, but a tense, methodical entry into a psychological vacuum. When officers approached the door, they were met by Jody Hildebrandt. She remained composed, her demeanor clinical and detached, as if the police were an intrusion into a private medical consultation. Ruby Franco was also present, maintaining a chillingly calm exterior. She did not ask about her son's welfare. She did not express the frantic concern of a mother whose child had vanished. Instead, she stood in the shadows of the home she had helped turn into a prison, her face a mask of righteous indifference. Inside, the investigators discovered a second victim, Ruby's 9-year-old daughter. She was found in a state that mirrored her brother's, emaciated, withdrawn, and initially hesitant to interact with the officers. It was as if she were waiting for permission to exist. The girl's physical condition confirmed that the abuse was not an isolated incident directed at the older boy, but a systematic application of the connection's philosophy across the siblings. She, too, was whisked away by medical personnel, leaving the house to the detectives and the forensic teams, who would spend the next several days unearthing the digital and physical evidence of the 8 passengers' fall. The arrest of Ruby Franco and Jody Hildebrandt was a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the loud, high-energy persona Ruby had projected to millions of followers for nearly a decade. As they were led away in handcuffs, the Red Rocks of Ivins stood as the final witnesses to the collapse of the Moms of Truth. The news of the arrests rippled through the digital world like a shockwave, but for the two children now lying in hospital beds, the world was finally silent. The 8 passengers' journey had ended in a tactical raid, and the woman who had built a career on the perfect family was now facing a reality that no amount of editing or lighting could fix. The tactical officers who moved through the residence noted the lack of traditional childhood items, the absence of the very things that Ruby had used as props in her videos. There were no colorful toys in the common areas, no signs of the vibrant life that a family of 8 should have produced. Instead, the house felt like a staging ground for a war on the spirit. The boy's escape hadn't just saved his own life. It had forced the state of Utah to look behind the curtain of a multi-million subscriber brand to find the rotting core of an extremist cult. The Day X of the Franca family wasn't a graduation or a holiday vlog. It was a desperate flight through the desert heat, led by a boy who refused to die in the shadows of his mother's truth. The transition from a tactical rescue to a criminal investigation required the authorities to peel back the layers of a digital and physical archive that Ruby Franca had been building for years. As the children were stabilized in the hospital, detectives moved into the Hildebrandt residence, not just to search for weapons, but to find the ideology that had weaponized a mother against her own offspring. What they discovered was a meticulously documented descent into madness, a paper trail that transformed the 8 Passengers brand from a parenting guide into a long-form confession of systematic torture. The centerpiece of the evidence was Ruby's personal journals. These were not the typical reflections of a stressed parent. They were clinical logs of a spiritual executioner. In hundreds of handwritten pages, Ruby documented the daily progress of her children's suffering with a detached, almost academic tone. She wrote about her 12-year-old son with a venom that shocked seasoned investigators, describing him as possessed by a dark spirit and wholly untruthful. To Ruby, his skeletal appearance and his weeping wounds were not signs of medical distress. They were manifestations of the evil she was working to extract. One entry detailed how she viewed his refusal to perform manual labor in the heat as a rebellion against God, justifying the use of more restrictive bindings. The paper trail of pain also revealed the specific mechanics of the abuse. Detectives recovered the silver duct tape and the ropes used for the children's meditations. More disturbingly, they found the containers of honey and cayenne pepper that had been applied to the boy's open sores. Ruby's writings confirmed that this was not a lapse in judgment, but a premeditated treatment designed to ensure that even in his moments of rest, the boy would feel the sting of his distortion. The journal served as a roadmap of the crimes, linking every physical injury found on the children to a specific spiritual lesson orchestrated by Ruby and Jody. Digital forensics teams simultaneously began the gargantuan task of archiving the connection's digital footprint. They recovered thousands of hours of footage, including private counseling sessions, where Jody Hildebrandt was seen coaching Ruby on how to further isolate and break her children. These videos showcased the psychological capture of the Franca family. In the recordings, Jody spoke with a hypnotic authority, telling Ruby that her children's screams were merely the darkness leaving their bodies. The investigation revealed that Ruby had become a disciple of a cult-like structure where the truth was whatever Jody Hildebrandt dictated. The Moms of Truth archives provided a chilling look at how this ideology was being marketed to other parents, turning a private tragedy into a profitable extremist business model. As the investigation broadened, it hit a series of red herrings and systemic failures that haunted the community. Detectives realized that the horror in Ivins was the final act of a play that had been performing in plain sight for half a decade. They reviewed the dozens of calls made to Child Protective Services between 2020 and 2022. Neighbors in Springville had reported children left alone for days, children who looked terrified, children who were being denied food. In 2020, a CPS investigator had actually walked through the Franca home following the beanbag punishment controversy. But Ruby, a master of the digital facade, had successfully manipulated the system. She had used her status as a parenting expert and her articulate, composed demeanor to dismiss the concerns as harassment from haters. The investigation also touched on the role of the community, the social echo of the digital age. Neighbors in the Eving cul-de-sac expressed a profound sense of guilt and frustration. They described the Hildebrand house as a black hole where the normal sounds of childhood were never heard. Rumors had swirled for months about the strange women in the big house, but the fear of intervening in a private, religious-based household had kept them at a distance. The case forced a painful reckoning for the local Mormon community and the broader influencer world, highlighting how the perfect mother archetype could be used as a shield for unthinkable cruelty. The most difficult aspect of the investigation was reconciling the 8 passengers, Ruby with the Evans Ruby. Forensics teams analyzed the transition, finding that the more Ruby engaged with Jodi's connaissance curriculum, the more she stripped her home of any evidence of maternal warmth. They found that she had systematically deleted years of family photos and videos that didn't align with the truth philosophy. By the time of the raid, the house was a vacuum, a place where the children's identities had been erased to make room for their mother's delusions. The detectives' work mirrored the real-life frustration of the local police, who had to build a case that would hold up against the inevitable defense that this was a religious parenting choice. The paper trail, however, was too stark to be ignored. The journals, the digital recordings, and the physical evidence of the duct tape and cayenne pepper formed a cohesive narrative of a mother who had traded her children's lives for a place at the right hand of a false prophet. The investigation concluded that the boy's escape hadn't just saved him. It had provided the authorities with the only key that could unlock the hidden penitentiary Ruby and Jodi had constructed. The paper trail of pain was complete, and the focus now moved from the red rocks of Evans to the cold, fluorescent light of a Utah courtroom. February 20th, 2024, marked the final shuttering of the 8 passengers legacy in a St. George, Utah courtroom. Ruby Frank, once the manicured matriarch of a digital empire, sat in a drab jail jumpsuit, a visceral contrast to the curated perfection of her former life. Beside her, Jodi Hildebrand remained a clinical figure of defiance. Both women had pleaded guilty to 4 counts of second-degree aggravated child abuse. When Ruby addressed the court, her voice lacked the sharp, moralizing edge of her Moms of Truth lectures. She wept as she apologized to her children, referring to them as her small brood, and claiming she had been blinded by a dark delusion that made her believe evil was good. She even thanked the officers who handcuffed her, describing them as the spiritual rescuers who had finally saved her family from her own hands. Judge John Walton, however, focused on the horrific reality of the Ivins home, which the prosecution likened to a concentration camp. He sentenced each woman to 4 consecutive terms of 1 to 15 years in prison. Under Utah law, while the math suggests 60 years, the actual time served is effectively capped at 30, a lifetime of reflection for a woman who mistook cruelty for a divine calling. The digital footprint of the Franca family remains, a haunting archive of a life that never truly existed. For the children, the Red Rocks of Utah are no longer a boundary, but the starting point of a long, arduous journey toward healing, far from the cameras that once commodified their every tear. As Ruby and Jodi adjust to the stark silence of a prison cell, the world is left to grapple with the debris of parenting, a reminder that behind every perfect filter, there may be a truth that no one was ever meant to see. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.